and I'm stoked for this conversation. I had a brief phone call with you last night, and just in that short 5 to 10 minute phone call, I knew that this conversation was going to be absolutely epic. So hopefully I'm not overselling it and it ends up being epic.
I'll do my best.
I think you'll do fine. So let's start with you just introducing yourself first.
Yeah. Well, I'm Dr. Stephen Hussey. I guess by training or pieces of paper with degrees, I'm a chiropractor. I also have a degree in functional medicine, human nutrition and functional medicine. But yeah, I guess what really defines me though is just I'm just a curious person, and I suffered from a lot of health issues as a kid, and I guess my life, the main aspect of my life or main theme of my life has just been trying to figure out why those things have happened, and I've had health struggles, even up until very recently, which we're going to talk about. But it's always trying to figure out why, because for me, understanding why does a few things. One, it helps me know how to move forward, know what the way forward is, I should say. And also it relinquishes that thing I don't understand's control over me. So then it doesn't feel like I'm helpless. So I can do something about it. So that's kind of what I've been like, not just in my health history, but also just relationships, everything about life, like understanding this. So I've gone down rabbit holes of like understanding people, like why are these people acting this way, so that I don't take it personally and understand what may be going on with them, all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I just more curious than anything. I guess that's more of an introduction of me than like my degrees or whatever. But yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. And I guess the next best question would be, how did you become interested in heart health, especially being that you're not formally trained as a medical doctor, so-called medical expert necessarily? What tipped you off to explore that?
Yeah, it's a long story. You ready for it?
Yeah, let's go.
So, like I mentioned, I had a lot of chronic issues as a kid, and those were like more inflammatory type things, like what they call inflammatory type things. So I had like irritable bowel syndrome, terrible allergies, asthma. I used to break out in hives like this big all over my body.
Wow.
And the doctors never really told me why. So my parents and I were just kind of thrust into the world of Western medicine, looking for answers or ways to manage that, which that was the key word, manage them. There was no, explanation of why they were happening. And then ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes at age 9, which heavily predisposed me to heart disease. And that's what I would read. I'd go to the endocrinologist's office and see the signs like, oh, you're going to have vascular disease. Your eyes are going to fail and all this. You're going to get, poor blood circulation in your feet and that kind of stuff. So that's what you look out for. So I'd always kind of like, I guess my ears perked up when I heard something about heart disease, even, in high school. And,
Did it make you feel afraid initially as a 9-year-old hearing that?
Yeah, a little bit. Although, like when you're a kid, though, you don't have a developed prefrontal cortex, so you're not really really thinking about the future. Which my blood sugar control reflected that in high school. It was not good, and I just didn't really have that foresight. But yeah, so that kind of sparked my interest in heart disease specifically. And so then throughout, in college, my girlfriend in college was into health, and we kind of discovered our passion for health together. Majored in health and wellness and pre-med type classes, and started to realize in college that I could live my life a certain way and get rid of those conditions I had. And I got rid of all of them, aside from type 1 diabetes, kind of collateral damage. Those cells don't make insulin anymore. But I still hold out hope that they could one day.
Yeah.
If I do the right things or find the right things. But yeah, so I thought that was interesting that no physician ever told me, hey, you could change your lifestyle and these hives would go away or whatever.
Is that what made you want to shift from, you talked about being pre-med almost at this point to no longer wanting to go to medical school?
Yeah, I had a really good relationship with my pediatric endocrinologist, and as far as like he was a good person, and he tried to help me explain or tried to help me understand what was going on in my body, and he's just a cool dude. So he kind of inspired me to want to go into medicine.
Got it.
But then I started learning these things that like I could change the way I live my life, and I was just like, he never really told me that stuff. So maybe I don't want to learn what he learned, or maybe that's not the best way to do things.
Yeah.
And my parents had always taken me to chiropractors as a kid, so I was familiar with that. So I was like, well, that sounds better, not knowing anything as a 20-year-old or whatever. And so I decided more chiropractic school. My girlfriend at the time was also going to naturopathic school, so I applied to the school in the same town as she was. So there's a lot of different things that made me decide that. But then it was just really, I thought that I was going to get the answers, from training, from these degrees I was going to get. And so after chiropractic school, I was I learned a lot of stuff, a lot of our basic understanding of what we think goes on or whatever. But I was unsatisfied, and I thought, oh, the master's degree, human nutrition, functional medicine, that's what's real. That's where the answers are. And I got that degree, and I was like, well, I don't know. Like, I still don't know why I'm type 1 or why these, whatever. So, I just kept that curiosity and kept looking. So most of what I'm probably going to tell you on this podcast today, I did not learn from any formal training.
That brings up a really good point. And I've said this before, that even on the so-called holistic side of things, the overwhelming majority, if not exclusively all of the traditional certifications going that route, are ultimately coming from a series of flawed premises and overlooked assumptions with respect to what happens in the human body and how the body works and what causes illness and what makes humans healthy.
Yeah, for sure. Like, even the functional medicine degree, like, it was more outside the box than traditional training on physiology and everything, but it was still like really based on diet and supplements.
Yeah.
And diet's important, obviously. But it was just like, you get this blood work, and based on the blood work, you treat the blood work with supplements. I was like, that's not a path to health. It's just not. And that never really made sense to me, even though I was trying to learn everything I could about the supplements and all this different stuff. But it's still a world based in biochemistry.
Yes.
Which is, there's probably some biochemistry that goes on in our body, but it's not the only thing. And what dictates that biochemistry is very important to understand. But based on that, like, I spent a lot of, like, after that degree, I moved around a lot. But I was poor after school, working as an associate chiropractor. And I could always control diet and exercise. That's what I can control. I couldn't even afford the supplements that I thought I needed or whatever at that time. And so, but I was always really good at that. I could exercise the way I wanted to, and I could eat the way I wanted to for the most part. And I controlled that stuff. And I, kind of thought that's what gives you health, And so for probably, 10 years, I guess 8 to 10 years, that's kind of what I did. And I maintained a high level of health, really started controlling type 1 and having really good A1Cs and that kind of stuff. And it was easy with the types of the whole food diets I was eating, especially, and I went more low carb for a type 1. That was really easy. Then unfortunately, when I was 34 years old, which is 4 years ago now, I had a widowmaker heart attack.
Wow.
Out of the blue. There was no symptoms beforehand. If you looked at my blood work, other than the cholesterol that we're going to talk about, everything looked perfect. Inflammatory markers were good. A1Cs and blood sugars were under control. And, there was things I think that led up to it, looking back. And, we're going to talk about heart attacks today, and what causes them. But, like, specifically for me, I think that it was a combination of a lot of different things. We were going through COVID, and there was things happening during COVID that I didn't agree with, and it was stressful to me. There was, I've always worked as an associate chiropractor, and then have like an online consulting business, but things that were happening to our clinic where I worked, like things that were from the outside, like out of our control, were stressful. It was not fun. And then, I was going through some relationship struggles. And then I was also convinced myself that you only need to drink water when you're thirsty. And so I was probably having about a cup of bone broth a day. And that was probably it, other than the water I'd get from food. So that, and then I got very stressful news about a close family member a day and a half before this happened. So Sunday night, we got that news. And it was the inability to do anything about that situation from me or anybody in my family to help this person because they were in a different country and it was COVID. We couldn't go. But I spent all day Monday trying to figure out if I could get to that person. And then Tuesday morning, woke up and probably unwisely did a very intense workout.
Mm-hmm. I could see where you would want to though, because I know
distract
for me,
myself.
distract myself, or sometimes there's some nuance here, relieve stress, to get that stress out of me. But also,
and I've also been like, that's the thing though, like diet and exercise, like no matter what's going on in my life, I was going to do those things.
So those are the tools you had at that time, really, to manage stress, you could say.
Yeah. And so, about 20 minutes after that workout, I started getting this pain right here. And at first it was different. And I was like, well, that's weird. I thought my pec was just tightening up. I used my pecs during the workout. I did like push-ups to failure and stuff. But then it got worse. And then I started to get like really hot. Like my whole body was just like flushed. So I went outside. It was January. And then it wasn't going away. It started to get worse. So I called an ambulance. I was like, this is not normal. And then we went to the hospital and they did the EKG, and as soon as I got in there, the ER doc read it and was like, possible STEMI, prep the cath lab. So we go into the cath lab. The whole time I just had like the worst pain in my life right here in my chest. Mm. There was no pain down my arm, no pain in my head or anything like that. It was just right here. Went through the whole thing, went to the cath lab. They did a heart cath, and they found that the arteries were primarily clean, except for this complete blockage of the LAD, which is the widowmaker, the STEMI heart attack. And so they intervened, and after the intervention, I didn't feel anything. Now, whether or not that, we can talk about whether or not that blockage was the cause of it, which it may or may not have been, which hopefully sparks some people's interest to keep listening. But yeah, so that was, in the hospital, like pretty demoralized, pretty, full of self-doubt, because I had been researching the heart and heart disease, for quite some time, and I'd started. Oh,
so you had already been researching?
Oh yeah,
got it.
Mainly like cholesterol stuff.
Got it. Okay.
And I was aware that the function of the heart, I don't think is to move the blood, and those types of things. And so what I initially started doing afterwards, well, we'll get to that, but like in the hospital, I was pretty demoralized, and I was just kind of throwing my hands up and I was like, hey guys, what caused this? And what happened? And I was willing to listen to anybody, like, give me your thoughts. And they just came back with your cholesterol cholesterol causes this. It was like a broken record. Yeah. And anytime I would try and ask questions, like, because they were trying to give me all kinds of medications and stuff. And I was like, well, what about magnesium as a blood thinner? And the attending was like, magnesium is not a blood thinner. And I was like, well, that's not true. You may not have a procedure for administering that to me right now. Here, I get that, but it is a blood thinner. One way that you could do that. So anyways, I got pretty reinvigorated getting all this bad information. They literally told me to eat a processed food diet. Some nurse came in and told me to eat Fig Newtons and animal crackers, and that was okay.
Oh my God.
So I was like, okay, this is bad. I was prescribed 11 different medications while in the hospital and told I would be on 5 the rest of my life.
Oh my goodness.
And I was open to the idea of taking some in the short term, and I did take a blood thinner for 6 months because there was a stent in there. And I didn't know how my body was going to react to that. I didn't want another clot to form. So, but I'm not on any medications now. So then, couldn't wait to get out of there. I left after 3 days, which they were reluctant to let me leave, but I was like, please let me leave. They were like, in order to leave, you have to show us you can be mobile. So I was doing laps around the cardiology floor, so then I got home and started my own kind of heart healthy routine. Something I just kind of, one of the main things they kept kind of pushing in my head was that you're going to develop heart failure. There's damage to some areas of your heart, and you're going to develop heart failure. And I knew at that time how good the research was for infrared sauna and heart failure, which people listen to the end of this, they'll understand why that is.
Yeah.
But so I started doing that. I found a sauna. My boss had one in his basement that nobody was using, so I started using that, and then I procured my own sauna. Started using that. But that's the only thing I did at first. So then 2 months later, And I wasn't using it that often. I was using it maybe a couple times a week, I guess. But then 2 months later, I started being active again. So I just started to walk or whatever. And I noticed there was pain in my leg, in my lower leg. And that my leg was fine the morning I had the heart attack, because I did that workout. I would sprint up a hill, do lunges to failure, and my leg was fine, no pain. But anytime I would exert myself a little bit, my pain or my leg would hurt really bad, even just walking to the airport fast. I was like, that's weird. It's like, well, I have like a DVT, intermittent claudication, something like that. And that's what it ended up being, was peripheral artery disease. So I finally got around to going and formally getting that test done about 6 months after the heart attack. They did Doppler ultrasound, and I had a 75 to 99% blockage of the artery in my leg. And that developed because of the thing they used to place the stent.
Wow.
So they went into the femoral artery in my groin. They went up, to place the stent here. And the device they used to seal up the artery, which they use so that people can sit up faster, because otherwise they have to be on their back a lot longer, and there's risk for clotting because of that. So they use this device to seal it up so you can sit up within 12 hours. But that device, I found literature that shows that it can change the blood flow dynamics going into the leg.
Oh, wow.
And again, people are going to learn later that blood flow dynamics are really, really important for the prevention of atherosclerosis. And so it changed the flow dynamics, and I developed that huge blockage there. But one thing that's really important to note there is how fast that happened. Because people will say like, oh, plaque takes years to develop. It's like, no, it can develop pretty fast if given the right conditions. And so that developed there. So at the time I went to a vascular surgeon, and they were like, well, we don't want to mess with it. Because when we start messing with them, you're able to do most things in your life. You just can't do some things you enjoy, like play soccer or snowboard or whatever. And so he was like, we're going to leave it alone, because when we start messing with them, they get worse. So I was like, okay, that sounds good. And I continued doing my thing. I started doing more sauna, getting more sunlight, doing more grounding. And I started setting my circadian rhythm at that time pretty hardcore. Like I was really diligent about it. Everything else stayed the same. My LDL level stayed the same. My diet, my animal-based diet stayed the same, like it was before all this. Everything stayed the same. My stress probably got a little worse, which may show you the power of the things that I did. But a year later, I got a follow-up test, and it was only 50% blocked.
Wow. And
then, so I kept going. At that time, the vascular surgeon said, well, we can't say it's better because we don't see these things get better. I was like, well,
mine did.
Look, right there. The technician who did the test came back in and repeated it, because she was like, we saw something we don't usually see. I'm going to just make sure. And she did the whole test again, and it was the same result.
Wow.
And then a year after that, it was completely normal.
Wow.
And then just this last May that we had, it was still normal.
Wow. So
just shows that it stayed normal. And no curiosity from the vascular surgeon, no like, well, what did you do, or anything like that. It was just, well, great. I guess you don't have to come back anymore.
Dude, I feel like you are speaking exactly my own experience in seeing my wife reverse 2 autoimmune conditions. I don't want to go off on a tangent on that, but literally the exact same thing. No intellectual curiosity, just, okay, looks like you don't need me anymore.
Yeah,
like,
I even gave him a copy of my book.
Yeah.
Because at that time it had been published.
Yeah.
And yeah, I never heard anything about it or anything.
Yeah.
So interesting, so that's almost unheard of. To reverse a 75 to 99% blockage of peripheral artery disease. And my heart also completely recovered with no medications. So the, originally the septum of my heart where the damage was severely hypokinetic or akinetic. So it's not conducting the signal to contract at all because it was damaged. And it's normal now. And the ejection fraction of my heart had dropped to 35 to 40%, which normal is 50 to 70. And 3 months after, maybe it was 4 or 5 months after, it was within the normal range. So it was like 55% the ejection fraction. So, and I was told I would never heal that without medications, that I would develop heart failure without medications, that I would have another heart attack without medications. And I'm just an N of one, I can't say that's going to happen for everybody, but it shows it is possible.
Right.
And if you look at the literature for type 1 diabetes and peripheral artery disease, they usually have worse outcomes, more chance of amputation, when that develops. And I completely reversed it, which is crazy, according to them. So, yeah, that's my story. That's why I'm interested in heart disease.
Totally understandable too.
Yeah, right.
It's cool that you're already interested in before, then you had this experience that made you sort of initiated you to deepen your understanding of what is truly the cause of heart disease, what is truly the cause of heart attacks, how does the heart actually work. One thing that I just want to briefly pull on is the perpetual stress that you were experiencing. And looking back in hindsight, obviously, I don't think you'd make the claim that perpetual stress is the sole cause of heart disease or heart attacks, but do you think that that was a major contributing factor in what led to your heart attack?
I think it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Yeah, being in that state of stress for a prolonged amount of time,
right?
Like 36 hours or so, 36 to 48 hours.
Well, it seems like you were in multiple phases too, where it was stress, prolonged over the course of.
I think dehydration was the other big factor.
Really,
because like I convinced myself that just a cup of bone broth, and I was struggling with a little bit of constipation at the time, and I was thinking about doing something about it. I was just like, well, this probably isn't normal. I need to change what I'm doing, but I hadn't gotten there yet. But I think that the vascular system's a hydraulic system. And if you don't have enough fluid in it, you're more likely to develop clotting, which is what plaque is. It's clotting material. It's not a buildup of cholesterol. And so that combined with stress, like if you look at like acute stress and the amount of the amount of increase of clotting factors that go up when you're under acute stress, it's astronomical, which makes sense because if you're under an acute stress, you think you're going to get injured. Like that's what your physiology thinks. Like you're under stress because you're running from something. It's going to increase clotting factors in case you get injured. Yeah. So that you don't bleed out. Right. So that makes sense. But yeah, I think those things were the combined factors. And then so in that situation, if you ask yourself, well, why didn't clotting happen everywhere? If that was the case, well, it happens most commonly in coronary arteries, especially the left anterior descending artery, the LAD, the widowmaker, because that's the artery under the most pressure of any artery in the entire body. So if there's something going wrong, then there's more pressure pushing up on the lining of the artery, causing more damage. That makes it more likely that a spontaneous clot will form there, which is what I think happened with me. But I have no idea what the artery looked like beforehand. Right. So I can't say for sure what it looked like, which is something that Thomas Cowan's challenged me on, and it's fun to think about those things. But yeah.
Awesome. So the first question that I want to ask, and this is just a larger question that I think will frame the rest of this conversation, is what does the mainstream health scientific community claim is the role of the heart?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they all think it's the mover of the blood. It's a pressure propulsion pump whose job is to move the blood around the body. But there are many issues with that idea. One is that it was kind of an observation type of thing. Like when you start studying the physiology or the anatomy, you see this contracting organ and you see blood coming out of it, so to speak. And then coming back to it, and you're like, oh, there's
this must
pump.
be the thing that pumps.
Yeah, it's a pump that moves. And so it's understandable, back in the day, if you were first looking at the system, to think that. But
really interesting point, though. Rudolf Steiner said in the early 1900s, so also back in the day, the heart is not a pump.
Yeah. But that was much later. So I'm like, when William Harvey was the first guy to quote unquote, like describe the heart and circulation, which was 1700 something.
Okay. Got it.
But even before then, back in, ancient societies like ancient Sumeria and Egypt and everywhere, they were just looking at anatomy like this, if they could. But then the Dark Ages, science kind of went away because the church came in and kind of pushed all that stuff aside. So there was a lull. But yeah, so Harvey was the first one. But yes, Rudolf Steiner did say that. But it was never really proven to begin with. It was just kind of assumed. Based on visualization. But if you look at it, first of all, if I was going to pump water up a hill, like from my toes back to my heart, I wouldn't put the pump at the top of the hill.
Right.
That wouldn't make sense. It's not efficient. It's also really, back in 18 something, there was a guy, a German guy, Thedusum, who was studying, the anatomy and everything, and he was like, if the heart was a pump, we would need a pump the size of a whale's to move the blood as much as it needs to be moved. So there has to be other ways that the blood is moving. So there was doubt all along the line,
right,
about this. But even then, even modern research, there was a study in 2003 where they looked at the efficiency of the heart as far as like how much energy it uses. And if you assume it's a pressure propulsion pump, and how much energy, based on how much energy it uses, it's only about 15 to 30% efficient, which doesn't make sense.
Yeah,
whether you believe we were created or evolved, that makes no sense.
Right.
That's not smart for it to do that, because it's not a pressure propulsion pump. There's no way it could be.
Yeah. It also makes the whole paradigm impossible, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, there's lots of evidence against it. And we have evidence that the blood is moving before the heart even forms in an embryo or in a fetus, because the heart doesn't form until about week 4, and the blood is moving before that.
Wow.
So we have, and there's actually some evidence that suggests, like in studying chick embryos, that it's the motion of the fluid that signals epigenetic changes in cells that actually create the formation of the heart.
Wow.
So the movement of blood is what creates the formation of the heart, rather than the formation of a heart creating blood flow.
Yeah, wow.
Right? Isn't that interesting?
It's like the whole chicken or the egg scenario when it comes to blood.
And so, it doesn't make sense that the heart would be the mover of the blood.
Yeah. So then you'd expect the next logical conclusion, okay, you falsified the idea that the heart is a pump because it's literally impossible for it, given where it's located, given its size, given the amount of energy it exerts to be pumping the blood throughout the body. So then you'd expect to find pumps maybe towards the bottom of the body, given that they need to pump the blood back up. But then when you look at the bottom of the body in your legs, you also don't find a pump. So we're going to get into later that there has to be some other driving factor moving the blood. And we'll also get into the true role of the heart here soon. But before we go there, the heart is not a pump. So first, let's define what arteriosclerosis is, and then also, how do you say that? Atherosclerosis? Atherosclerosis. Yeah. Okay. Define what both of those are, and then also what the mainstream says is the cause of both of those things.
Yeah. Well, atherosclerosis is just, there's different types of atherosclerosis. Like I had peripheral artery disease, which is atherosclerosis in the periphery somewhere. And then there's coronary atherosclerosis, which, by the way, was nearly unheard of in the early 1900s, like the 1910s or whatever. Very low rates of coronary artery disease. And it was only, during world wars and everything that it started to increase. So it's basically the development of plaque in the arteries. So this, to me, it's clotting tissue. When you look at the studies, it's clotting tissue, which is the same tissue that forms if I cut my skin and a scab forms, something that stops the bleeding from damage. Okay. So what the mainstream says it is an accumulation of cholesterol. And other things. And that cholesterol initially causes damage. And then, yes, other things may happen, right? They say, but it's all initiated by cholesterol. And these fatty streaks that you see, that's what they say it is. And there was never any proof from that theory. So if you want, I can get into the backstory of how cholesterol got blamed.
Let's go there since we already brought it up. Let's see how cholesterol got blamed and see how cholesterol is not actually the problem. There's different types of cholesterol, and how cholesterol in many cases is actually healthy and necessary for the body too.
So there's a molecule called cholesterol, and then that cholesterol is packaged in these lipoproteins, LDL, the things people know on their lipid panels, that kind of stuff. So like I mentioned, in the early 1900s, coronary artery disease was mostly unheard of. And there was still some like deaths from heart disease, but it was more like cardiac arrest type stuff. But then we started to see this slow rise, and in the 40s, it really started to increase. And in the 50s, when Eisenhower was president, it was really starting to increase a lot. And people were scared, I guess. There was this mentality, we don't know what this is. And then Eisenhower had a heart attack while he was president. So it was just on everybody's radar. What is this new disease and why is it happening? And so this one guy named Ansel Keys, I think he was maybe coerced. I don't know. Maybe he was offered money to give people an answer. I don't know for sure. But yeah, he started doing this research, and it was, associational research, which is the lowest form of research there is for a reason, which I'll talk about in a minute. But he basically compared the amount of saturated fat and cholesterol that people ate in their diets in different countries, and then looked at how much heart disease those countries had.
Mm-hmm.
And we had data from 22 countries available at that time. And he picked the 6 countries, and then later 7, because he repeated the study a few years later with 7 countries, that gave him a correlation between consumption of saturated fat and cholesterol in the diet and rates of heart disease. So he cherry picked the data.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just the tip of the iceberg as far as like the flaws with that. I mean, just the flaws of epidemiology in general. Like, epidemiology is a type of research that you can only show an association. You can't show
Possible
causation.
association.
Possible,
Exactly.
yeah.
Right.
So the example I give is like, if I'm standing on the sidewalk and I see that it's cloudy and there's a traffic jam in front of me, I can't say the clouds caused the traffic jam or the traffic jam caused the clouds.
Right.
All I can say is that they're happening at the same time right now.
Right.
If I wanted to see if clouds cause traffic jams, I'd have to recreate clouds enough times and see if a traffic jam happened.
Right.
And then even then, I wouldn't know
scientific
how
method.
it was creating it. I would just know that it did somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But that literature has never really been done. It's always associational when it comes to LDL and heart disease or cholesterol and heart disease.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, just as a funny little aside, somebody on Instagram tagged one of the vegan doctors in one of my posts, and he came back with, "I prefer real science." And so he posted this link to this study. So I went and looked up the study, and it was like this meta-analysis or systematic review of LDL and atherosclerosis. And it said it was conclusive that it does. It was all associational research. And then you scroll down to the bottom, and every single author had at least 5 conflicts of interest with a pharmaceutical company.
Wow.
Right? So there's that whole side of things. But anyway, so that was Ansel Keys' theory. He put it out to the public, and there's that famous, issue of Time magazine where it's like, cholesterol's bad, there's a frowny face with a bacon, that kind of thing. And so this idea took off, but then that theory was heavily tested. It's probably one of the most heavily tested nutritional theories out there because it's very expensive to do nutritional research. It takes years. And so there was many studies, probably 5 or 6 different studies done at that time, like in the 60s and 70s, where they basically removed saturated, or they replaced saturated fat in people's diets with unsaturated fat. In the form of different plant foods or margarines and things like that. And all those studies found that the more unsaturated fat that people ate, the more heart disease and all-cause mortality they had. There was one called the Minnesota Coronary Survey, which Ansel Keys was the lead author on, the lead investigator on, but his name was left off the study.
Interesting.
There was the Sydney Diet Heart Study. There was one in Finland. There was one in Norway. There was a lot of different ones done. But yeah, so this guy named Christopher Ramsden in like 2013, I think it was, he went back and he dug up the data for all those studies, and he found that they omitted data in those studies. And he found that they did that in order to make it look better than it was, because it was already looked bad from what they were wanting. So he tracked down one of the lead authors of one of the studies, and he said, "Well, why'd you do this?" And he was like, "Well, we didn't get the result we wanted."
Wow.
Right? So that's the state of not just nutritional research, but a lot of research out there.
Totally.
Is in that state. And they also didn't publish, like they finished the study in 1973 or something like that, the Minnesota Coronary Survey, and they didn't publish it until 84, I think. Or maybe, no, it was 89, until 89, because they just didn't get the result they wanted. And they published it in some small journal that nobody reads. Rather, they had the clout to publish it in the Lancet or the BMJ or whatever, and they didn't, because the theory had already taken off.
Right.
And there was a lot of money behind this theory. The big food companies wanted you to convince you that animal foods are bad, to eat their processed carbohydrates. The pharmaceutical company wanted to convince us that cholesterol was bad because they had a drug that could lower it.
Right.
And the more, and that was the thing. In 1984, they got together in this committee, and they incorrectly decided, influenced by pharma, that cholesterol is bad and the LDL is bad. We should lower it. And they said originally that LDL should be 250 or lower. And then over the years, it became 200, and then 150, and then 100. Because the lower that recommendation is, the more people would need, quote unquote, need
right.
the drugs, right? The more drugs you could sell, which means we have no idea what cholesterol is supposed to be.
Right.
They just picked it from the beginning and they said, well, let's just lower it, Yeah, it's completely bogus. And now, there is a lot of evidence now, like just in 2020, at least concerning saturated fat, there was a systematic review published. It was like, yeah, the claims in saturated fat were overblown, but you don't hear that from cardiologists. No. you don't hear that. And there's a lot of data, the LDL is not the cause. Like David Diamond and his group have done a lot of work with that, but you don't hear about that. And now they're like, oh, now it's the ApoB, or it's the Lp(a), or the oxidized ones. It's all of them. And I would argue it's none of them. It's the wrong marker we should be tracking. And it's been a giant distraction from what the actual causes of atherosclerosis are. And that's a big problem because now everybody's just focused on micromanaging lipids, again, treating a blood work panel,
right,
rather than treating a person.
Right.
So,
right. And so if we go back to the 1940s and 50s, I would imagine that you largely agree with the work of Dr. Weston A. Price, and correct me if I'm wrong on that, in that when analyzing these societies across the world and the rise of ultra-processed foods, it's ultimately eating a diet that is not, let's say, not the best for human beings is one of many possible causes for the rise in heart disease and heart attacks and things like this. And they falsely blamed fats as the issue and cholesterol.
Yeah, they falsely blamed it because they could make money off of that.
Right.
Like Weston Price works is very, really important. And he was a very meticulous researcher. And I think though, however, he was not accounting for the entire environment of the people he was studying.
Right.
He was looking at their diets, and he was mainly looking, and that was great because they were eating things that are more appropriate for humans. And he was comparing that when people went to different diets, they experienced issues with their health, and that because diet is important.
But it was more about the entirety of their lifestyle and diet.
Yeah, you look at where these people were living, and he was having to travel to places that were not civilization to study these people.
Right.
And so that means light. That means community. That means their stress levels. That means contact with the earth. That means circadian rhythm. Like, look at these people, what type of life they're living, right? It wasn't just the food they were eating, even though the food they were eating was way better. It was a lot of different factors.
Modern lifestyle itself, ultimately.
Yeah.
I know we'll get into a lot of that with respect to light, environment, and things like this. Okay, so now let's talk about arteriosclerosis. What the mainstream says is the cause of that.
Yeah. So they say that you get this cholesterol molecules or these LDL molecules in your blood, and if they're too high, then they just go into and they damage the lining of the artery, or they embed themselves in the line. They cause this fatty streak, and that causes damage. And then there's this inflammatory response, and then the body develops plaque long term, and it's what drives atherosclerosis is this one biomolecule, which is incredibly myopic. To first of all, they're ignoring everything else that's in the blood.
Right.
There's water in there, there's electrolytes in there, there's red blood cells, there's clotting factors. They're ignoring all that. It's just the lipids, right? Because that's convenient for the money-making theory that Western medicine needs.
For statins and all of the things.
For statins. Right, exactly. And as we're going to learn, not just that, but the treatment of it.
Yeah.
And how we treat it. We treat the lesion. It's the problem.
Yeah.
Which is not really the problem, in my opinion. So anyways, that's what they say. But the only problem with that is that when you analyze plaque, there's one study that says that they took plaque out of somebody, and it was 87% clotting tissue, fibrotic clotting tissue, plus or minus 8%, depending on which person they were looking at. And so these are on autopsy. And people will say, well, those are on autopsy. That's plaque that's been there forever. And yeah, it has been there forever. But there's also studies that show, and I talk about all this stuff in my book and in my courses, like that clotting tissue is the mediator of atherosclerosis from the beginning. It plays a role in every single aspect of the development of atherosclerosis. It's clotting tissue. And so it makes sense, though, because it's what happens in response to damage. Like if I damage my skin, my body can't heal that immediately. So it has to make a scab, has to clot to stop the bleeding so the body can heal it over time. The problem with atherosclerosis is we've interfered with the body's ability to heal. So What condition do we know delays wound healing? Diabetes. Why is diabetes so heavily associated with atherosclerosis? It's like the number one risk factor, being insulin resistant or diabetic, because you've interfered with wound healing. And wounds are happening on the lining of the artery, and then you can't heal them. So guess what happens? It progresses, and more builds up, right? So in my opinion, looking at it, and it's not just that. It's not just being diabetic, because you could have a situation where whatever's damaging the lining of the artery is so overwhelming that your body can't heal it in time, and it's going to develop plaque because of that. But then acute stress could damage the lining of the artery, but it's supposed to be able to heal after that. So in my opinion, we've done a few things that have led to this epidemic of heart disease being the number one killer, and coronary artery disease being one of the most common diseases out there. It's that we've removed the protection of lining of the artery, which is structured water, which is mainly built by infrared light exposure, among other things. Remove that protection, and that happened when we invented fluorescent lighting and got away from incandescent and fire and sunlight. And then we added a bunch of insults. We added a bunch of processed foods and synthetic toxins and things that our bodies have never seen before. So you remove the protection and then you add the insult. That's not a good recipe.
Right.
And then we've interfered with the body's ability to heal it. And that is driven by poor metabolic health, which is insulin resistance, leptin resistance, insulin resistance, and then eventually type 2 diabetes. And that is driven by processed food diet, but mainly by disrupted circadian rhythm. Right. That's the main thing that disrupts our metabolic health. And then the processed food diets are just fuel to the flames. Yep. So
would you also throw in emotional stress or suppressed emotions as it relates to those things that destructure the fourth phase water, which I know we'll get into?
Yeah, it's one of the things that can, but also being in that state, whether it's a stored past trauma or just not dealing with emotions or living in a state of a poor emotion, they're creating a stress response that resulting in high cortisol, which is resulting in insulin resistance, which is leading to diabetes. Yeah, it's all like a downstream effect, right. But it's just one thing that's doing it. This is a very multifactorial disease. And I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out all those factors.
No, I agree with everything you just said there too. Yeah, and I'm so excited to unpack.
So you want to get into structural water, like that explains exactly what clotting is.
Yeah, totally. So before we get there though, what does the mainstream say? I know for many this will be rhetorical, but I just want to hear from you. What does the mainstream say is the cause of heart attacks?
They'll say that it's a gradual narrowing of an artery, a coronary artery. And so it'll the plaque will start to form up. And then, like we said, it can't heal. Yep. They don't necessarily know that. But then it just continues to close and eventually narrows the artery until it's blocked. That's one thing that can happen. And it restricts the blood flow that way. Or they'll say that maybe it's like 50% narrowed or whatever, but there's some soft plaque. And that part of that plaque will rupture, and then that rupture will cause a heart attack because it'll acutely block the artery right there. But there's literature, there's work of different scientists that has been largely ignored by cardiology and mainstream medicine that show that neither of those things are true in the majority of cases, that the drivers of heart attack are not that. And one of those researchers emphasizes more of this heart attack that can occur with no blockage whatsoever, which is more emotion related, imbalance in the autonomic nervous system signaling to the heart. But I still think that's a minority of heart attacks. So this is one thing I disagree with Tom Cowan on. It's definitely more heart attacks than we think are caused by that. But I do think heart attacks, like in my case, can be caused by a clot situation, but it's an acute clotting situation, and it's not a plaque rupture. It's due to bad or poor blood flow dynamics combined with inflammation at the time. And sometimes it can form a clot that's big enough to block an entire artery, even if there's no atherosclerosis there to begin with. Because when they went in to do the angiogram to look at my heart, there was no atherosclerosis. There's clean everywhere except for this spot that was 100% blockage. And so it's very hard for me to believe that I developed a slow stenosis over time with no symptoms whatsoever, or no calcification whatsoever. Because I had a CAC score done, which is a measurement of how much calcified plaque there is in the arteries of your heart, which doesn't measure soft plaque. But it's hard for me to believe that I developed an 100% blockage over time, slowly, and none of it got calcified. None of it, because my score was 0 at that 6 months prior to the heart attack. So that it suggests that I had a very low risk of a heart attack, according to the literature. But here we go, 6 months later, there's a heart attack. So to me, it's one of two things. It's an acute clot that occurs because of changes in flow dynamics. It happens too quickly that the body can't build collateral arteries around it, or it's this change of emotional signaling or autonomic nervous system signaling to the heart, which forces a different metabolism of the heart, which can ultimately lead to tissue death. Which, again, we can talk about the details of that too. But yeah, we have studies that show that there's this one study where they looked at, it was in 2006. They looked at over 230,000, I think, hospital admissions in different places across the country of people who were coming to the hospital with a heart attack. And within 24 hours, they measured their lipids, because that's just standard protocol, what they do in the hospital. And 75% of those people coming to the hospital with a heart attack had normal cholesterol levels. So now that doesn't say too much, because cholesterol levels fluctuate all the time.
Right.
Which, when people get their lipid levels drawn, and they say, oh, my cholesterol is high. Like, well, it was high at that one snapshot in time when you took that blood test, but it's changed a million times since you got that blood test.
I figured you'd have the same opinion as me on blood tests too.
So we can't say that it is that, and unless you have a continuous lipid monitor, you don't really know what it is. Right. But regardless, there's really no evidence that higher cholesterol is more associated with atherosclerosis or heart attacks.
It's just so crazy, though, when you look at most people in the world today are obsessed, especially as they get older, with monitoring their cholesterol levels. Like, that is still so pervasive among society. Even a lot of my family members, they're just trying to do whatever they can to lower their cholesterol, and eating a low cholesterol, ultimately low fat diet. That's still, luckily it's starting to go away, but that's still a trend.
Yeah. Well, and the argument that a lot of people make to me is like, that, well, since 1984, when they decided LDL was bad and that cholesterol or that statins were going to be the solution, that heart disease has come down a little bit. And it did for a while. It came down a little bit, but it's still astronomically higher than it was at the beginning of the century.
But then things like statins also present other problems, and that's the whole point.
Yeah. Well, and it's likely that drop happened because people have, if you look at the trends, people have been eating healthier. They've been smoking a lot less, which is probably a really big one. And they've been exercising more in general. The population in America has been. So was it the statins people are taking, which is the number one prescribed drug, or is it those other lifestyle modifications? And if you look at the data on statins, we can talk about the statin trials that they use to put them up on a pedestal. But let's
talk about those.
Yeah, there was a study, I think in 2022, where they looked at all those statin trials that they use, the Forest trial, the Jupiter trial, the Ascot trial, West of Scotland trial, all these different trials they use, these clinical trials, RCTs, right?
Yep.
And they assess them using absolute risk instead of relative risk in this study. And they basically found that, they really don't make a difference at all.
Yeah.
Right. But if you look at all those studies, they're all reporting their statistics, lots of them with relative risk, or they're ignoring the number needed to treat, or all this stuff. You can see all these, how they manipulate the statistics to make them look better than they are. And when you get into that, it's really, really disheartening. Yeah. And it really starts to show you that, basic science research is fascinating to me. It still may be myopic and it may not be the complete picture, but it's like somebody trying to discover something new and how does something work? These medical clinical trials are just trash, right? Complete trash. Because all they do, they try and eliminate all the variables, right? Which is not real life. You can't eliminate all variables. That's never going to happen to me as a person, to have just one variable. So they try and do that, but then they mess with the statistics to get what they want. And these are more like marketing ploys to do these studies, so they can push more drugs, push their product. But just as an example, 2 examples, the Jupiter trial, they had like a group that was taking statins and a group that wasn't. And they stopped the trial early for whatever reasons. They didn't really say why, but they claimed that, they claimed that they stopped it early because they had already seen benefit. But if you looked at the statistics at those studies, when they stopped the trial, there had been 9 adverse events, heart attack or stroke, in the treatment group and 9 in the non-treatment group. So it was exactly the same. So we're just like, why'd you stop the trial? And then you look at all the conflicts of interest, and what they really saw was they saw a trend toward harm of taking statins, so they stopped the trial.
And what specifically was it harming?
It was, so like at first, the non-treatment group was having more events, right? But then the statin group slowly caught up, or quickly caught up. And when it got to be the same, they're like, okay, we're going to stop the trial, right? Because they saw it increasing so fast that they knew it was going to surpass that. But in reality, it was the same. And that's what most of the studies show, that there's no difference as far as cardiovascular outcomes or whatever. But then, yes, there's all the side effects from statins. So this other trial, the ASCOT trial, I forget what ASCOT stands for, but in that study, they had a treatment group and a control group. And the treatment group, 98.1% of the people did not have a adverse event, a stroke or a heart attack. And 97% of the control group did not have. So technically, the treatment group was 1.1% better. So 1.1% doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Like,
not statistically significant.
Right, exactly. It's not much of a difference. I wouldn't take that. I wouldn't take that drug for a 1%, difference.
Especially when you're only looking, again, to emphasize that one specific metric without considering the downstream effects and the side effects. I call them primary effects of that medicine. It's
not worth it, right? Same with number needed to treat. Like a lot of those studies, they're like 1 in 39 people would have to take the drug for 5 years to prevent 1 heart attack. It's like, I don't think I want to take that based on the side effects. Anyways, so in the ASCOT trial, that's the absolute risk reduction is 1.1%. And that's likely because of mild anti-inflammatory effects that statins do provide, which I would much rather get those effects in other ways and more effectively in other ways than with statins and have the side effects. But the headline for that trial was that statins reduce a risk of a cardiovascular event 36%.
Of course.
It's like, how'd they get that?
Right.
And if you look at it, if you do relative risk, which with relative risk, you can compare anything to anything.
Yep.
Right. And so what they did was they compared the 1.1% reduction between the two groups to the 3% that did have a heart attack in the control group.
Yep.
And that's about 36%.
Yep.
Which makes no sense whatsoever. And that's the headline that's out there. And then if you look at like the fine print in the headline, it says the real difference was 1%.
What's up, you guys? I'm here with Matt Maruca, the founder of Raw Optics, to talk about something that I would say the overwhelming majority of people in the holistic health community totally overlook: light and circadian rhythm health.
All of our cells contain these organelles called mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. They make energy, they convert food into useful chemical energy. And it turns out mitochondria are largely controlled by our circadian rhythm. Our mitochondria are more active during the day under the influence of sunlight. When the sun goes away, our mitochondria have the opportunity to rest, repair, and regenerate when we're not being active. When it gets dark, the brain releases melatonin, and melatonin goes in and actually repairs the mitochondria, repairs all the oxidative damage that happens. Now, if we're exposed to blue light from all the artificial light sources, your phone, your iPad, your computer, your TV, the lead scientist we work with, Dr. Alexander Wunsch from Germany, actually calls it light doping. So people today are sort of being light doped by their employers with artificial blue enriched lighting to increase their productivity at the expense of their health, mental health, and long-term health and well-being. And so just by being exposed to artificial light at night can actually have a massive effect on the body's rhythm, cellular repair, and overall health and function. So we designed lenses that specifically block these disruptive wavelengths of light. So that's why we created daylight lenses. They protect your eyes from the physical damage of short wavelength blue light, but also offer a bit of a protective and relaxing effect for your hormonal system as well, but not to the degree of the sunset lenses, which are designed to basically make you really tired and even kind of knock you out in the evening. So these are the two lenses we offer so that you can have protection at the right levels, in the right way, at the right time. And then sunset lenses, you wear these 2-3 hours before bed or just from the sunset until sleep, so that your brain can register, okay, the sunset, it's time for me to release that melatonin naturally so I can wind down and not have to use alcohol, weed, sleeping pills and other things that so many people unfortunately have become dependent on because we're constantly disrupting our body's release of its natural sleep hormone.
So if you want to take control of your light and optimize your biology, head to the show notes or go to rawoptics.com and use code TWF10 at checkout for 10% off. Hey y'all, I'm here with Melissa Kupsch from Remedy Academy of Homeopathy. We are so stoked here at the Way Forward to be partnering with Melissa and Remedy in order to spread the message of homeopathy across the world, and also to partner on the eventual development of healing centers across the United States.
People are pretty quickly coming to realize that frequency is the future of medicine. We are witnessing the great resurgence of homeopathy right now. We're really moving away from that suppressive medical model. Whether it's for eczema, asthma, hormones, fertility, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it is, it all starts as energy in the person's field first. If we change our field, we can completely change our life. Our 2-year academy is open worldwide to anyone who wants to become a homeopath. We've got 5 lecturers and we currently have over 500 students enrolled, which is record numbers in our field. A career in homeopathy is amazing for anyone who wants flexibility in their work and who wants to be valuable in creating this new world. We have stay-at-home parents enrolled, we have ex-medical professionals, grandparents signed up who want to learn how to heal their grandchildren and pass on that invaluable knowledge. We even have husband and wife teams. So my husband enrolled in the course with no prior knowledge of health as a background, and he is loving it.
Kylie is also enrolled as well, so my partner is, and she's so stoked to become a homeopath and to be helping to spread this message across the world.
The thing that we hear from so many of our students is, I found my thing. Homeopathy is the key. We harness frequencies from nature and we alter the field of all creations. So if anybody wants to join us or they want to know more about it, they can visit our website.
Yeah, and all that information will be in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about Remedy Academy, also RMDY Collective, also some of the homeopathic products that they have, please just head to the show notes. All of that will be listed there. Yeah. I brought this up on an episode I just did with Andy Kaufman. We also talked about absolute risk reduction, relative risk reduction. And Tom, funny enough, has a funny story about when he was at medical school where he asked his professor why they use that metric because it's incredibly misleading. And the professor basically blatantly said, well, no one would take the drugs if we use the other one.
To be honest, at least.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. So,
yeah. So and then, all the side effects, if you look at the mechanisms of how statins work, they inhibit I think it's the second reaction, maybe the third, the HMG-CoA reductase. That's what they are, because they stop that step in the making of cholesterol. And there's like this 20-step process of making cholesterol. And so when you stop that step, not only do you not get cholesterol, but you don't get all the intermediate molecules that are made while making cholesterol. And those intermediate molecules are used for a lot of different things. There's one of them, farnesyl PP, I think it is, and that's used for making of CoQ10, which is incredibly important for mitochondrial function, especially in the heart, because the heart is one of the most dense tissues in mitochondria. And so when you interfere with that, that's why there's mechanisms that have been illustrated that statins can induce heart failure, because the mitochondria function is so poor.
Which is so ironic too.
Yeah. And then there's evidence that it's
lowers testosterone too, right?
Oh yeah. Well, it lowers testosterone because you're depriving the body of cholesterol, and testosterone is made of, all your sex hormones are made of cholesterol. So you need that. And if you're taking a statin and you're under a lot of stress, then cortisol is also being stolen. So then you're going to end up with low sex hormones and imbalances in sex hormones.
Yep.
But
that's why you see so many people as they get older, when they take statins, they end up having testosterone issues. So many people.
Oh yeah.
So many men.
Among many other things.
Yeah.
But so another molecule that's made in that process is called dolicol. And dolicol is critically important for the function of insulin receptors. So if you deprive the body of that, you're going to get insulin resistance. And that's what the studies show. You're much more likely to develop diabetes if you take a statin drug. And there's multiple studies like that, which diabetes, as we talked about before, is the number one risk factor. Insulin resistance is the number one risk factor for developing atherosclerosis. It just makes no sense whatsoever. And then there's also molecules like that are used for making or converting vitamin K, which is helpful for not having calcium deposits into the arteries. So lots of different things. I mean, there's cognitive issues, which some people say the studies on that are, on the fence. But yeah, muscle pain, which is something as a chiropractor, I treat a lot of muscle pain. And so eventually if I'm not getting somewhere with somebody, I'm like, wait a second, are you on a statin? Lots of times it's yes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
What about blood thinners? Because I know you said you were on one briefly for just a brief period of time, but what is the efficacy of those, and what is the intention of those? And yeah, let's just start there, I guess.
Yeah, it's a great segue to discussing what actually causes atherosclerosis.
Yeah,
because clotting is what causes atherosclerosis. So what they're trying to do with the blood thinner is prevent clotting. And so there's a biochemical way that you can prevent clotting, which is a drug, a pharmaceutical. And the way that prevents clotting is it interferes with clotting factors. So in school, we learn about physiology, and there's all these clotting factors in the blood that involve platelets and all this stuff. And that when the body gets a signal to clot, all those things are activated and we get a clotting response for like a scab, if you cut your skin or something like that. And that's supposed to happen sometimes. We need that to happen sometimes because there's going to be wear and tear. We're going to get injuries. Even on the lining of the artery, we can get some injuries, right? And so that clotting response is needed sometimes. So, if you take a blood thinner, especially a pretty aggressive blood thinner, then there's risk of bleeding. Even with baby aspirin, there's some studies that suggest there's a risk of GI bleeding and things like that. You're interfering with that normal clotting response. I would argue that, well, first of all, just ask any physician, any ER physician, hey, do people on blood thinners never have heart attacks? And they would say, no, absolutely. People on blood thinners always come in here having heart attacks. So it doesn't prevent a clotting response or that kind of issue, right? It's not the solution. So for me, what actually does cause plaque to form or clotting response to happen is because we have, Rudolf Virchow told us this back in 1856. And it still holds true in medicine today. There's published papers still quoting Virchow. He says that it's damage to the lining of the artery, poor or stagnant blood flow, and when elements of blood get too sticky or coagulative, they're sticking together too much, viscous, so to speak. Those three things predispose us to a clotting response. And so if you look at what structured water does in the arteries, in the lining of the arteries, or just in the artery in general, in the environment of that, it prevents all those things. And so earlier when I said, we remove the protection, which is the infrared light or the structured water in the arteries, this is what I'm talking about. We remove the things, or the stimuli that create structured water in our arteries that prevent us from a clotting response, unless there's some overwhelming toxic exposure or something like that damages the artery. And that's so structured water is been discovered, or at least observed, I guess, by many scientists over the last 100 years.
Yep.
And Gerald Pollack has made it the most famous as of recently. But Gilbert Ling and James Clegg and Jim Oshman and Fritz Albert Popp and Albert St. Georgi, they all talked about it. Mei Wan Ho, they all talked about it in their work. And so what structured water is that water has the ability to hold energy. And when it does, and it holds sufficient energy and it gets next to a water-loving surface, which all biological surfaces in the body are water-loving, hydrophilic, then it will actually structure itself into more of a gel. So this structured water has different names: exclusion zone water, fourth phase water, because it's not ice and it's not water, but it's kind of like this consistency of raw egg white, this gelatinous type substance. And they've shown that this does indeed happen on the lining of the arteries. And the reason that exclusion zone water is called exclusion zone water is because it has the ability to exclude anything that's not it. So, and they've shown this in Dr. Pollack's lab, that the only thing that can penetrate it is very small hydrated ions of minerals. So anything sodium or potassium or smaller can penetrate it, which should trigger any cellular physiologist. Oh, sodium, potassium, what?
Yeah.
But anyway, so in the lining of the artery, if we have structured water on the lining of the artery, nothing can touch it. And so I think a potassium ion is 0.25 nanometers. And that's what can penetrate it. And a sodium ion is 0.27. So it's a very hard cutoff. It's 0.02 nanometers to cut off that can penetrate and what can't. And an LDL molecule is 24 nanometers. So there's no way it's going to penetrate it if we have structured water there. So that's the flaw that everybody's missing, that are arguing about the lipids over there. They're just like oxidized LDL, LP(a), they're all way too big if we build structured water there. So it protects the lining of the artery. That's Virchow's triad number 1. We prevent the artery from being damaged.
And at this point, we're talking on the cellular level too, because cells are comprised of 70% water, but this type of water, again, is fourth phase water, and it's not liquid water as we know it to be.
Right.
Yeah.
So this also occurs in cells.
Yeah.
Yes. It's the main component of the water in the cells, or the main makeup of the water in the cells. But here we're talking about blood.
Yeah. Okay. So we are speaking about
yes.
blood specifically here.
Yeah. So
okay.
this is, because the blood is half water.
Yeah. Okay.
Or about half water. And so yeah, that's Virchow's triad number 1. Number 2 is Virchow says keep blood moving. And so they've shown over and over again in Dr. Pollack's lab that the blood moves by itself by these mechanisms. So structured water, the way that it forms, because of the way that it forms, it cleaves off one of the hydrogens. So it's not H2O anymore. It's H3O2. H3O2. And so, but one of those hydrogens is left out into the lumen of the artery, and the other oxygen and hydrogen team up with other oxygens and hydrogens, and that's what gives it, they kind of bind together, and that's what gives us the structure.
Crystalline structure almost. Right.
Yeah, that's what they call it,
yeah,
structured
if you
water.
look at, Dr. Pollack has done several talks on this, but when it converts from H2O to H3O2, the way it works when all of those molecules are next to each other, it ends up forming this like perfect crystalline grid.
Yeah, and then they line up next to each other, kind of like, I imagine it like I used to work at Lowe's and unload fence panels. So like fence panels on the lining. So it creates this these layers.
Yeah.
And those layers stack up around the whole lumen of the artery, right? And so when they do that, because there's this very negative area, because the oxygen's a bigger molecule, and there's also energy that can now travel through that structured water, and it's a negative charge of energy. Yep. It creates this very electronegatively charged space, which is structured water. And then you have these hydrogen ions that are pushed into the middle, creating very positive space. And that positive next to a negative is a battery,
right?
Which is what we all know when we put a battery in something, we have to make sure the positive and negative is aligned properly. Right. And so that energy created by that battery, which is really the energy source of everything in our body, it's not ATP. That's the storage form of energy, is there in the blood vessels. Then they've actually shown that this energy does the work of moving fluid, and they can do that. So they've taken a tube of a hydrophilic substance, put it in water, and they put energy on it, infrared light, and the water starts moving through the tube with no and they've shown this happens in chick embryos too. It happens in arteries of living things.
Right.
It continues to move. So they stop the heart of a chick embryo, and the blood continued to move. And if they put infrared light on it, it moved even faster. Right. So that's Virchow's triad number 2, is keep the blood moving. And so that's infrared light. Right.
And so what you're getting at here, just like to emphasize that point that people may have missed, overlooked the significance of that, is this is now a replacement for this understanding of how the blood actually moves, and like this missing link that, okay, it's the heart's not a pump. There's no way it can possibly pump the blood. We already discussed that. We don't have pumps in our legs. So what is the mechanism? What is the driving factor to keep the blood moving? And that's what we're talking about right now.
It's the main one, yes. There are some other ones too, but that's the main one. Yeah. It should be the main one. If it's not, because we don't have enough structured water, then it becomes not the main one. But yeah, so when I say things like, the heart is not what moves the blood, this is how it happens, or how it should happen. But also grounding and avoiding non-native EMF and all these different things, which I'm sure we'll get into later.
Well, that just increases, correct me if I'm wrong in this, that just increases the negative charge, though, of the fourth phase water in your body, which ultimately just keeps that in flow as well with respect to your blood.
Yeah. Well, like generally, I mean, we may be jumping ahead, but like generally, life is about harvesting energy from your environment. And when you have that energy, it can do the physiology it needs to. Right. And part of that physiology is moving blood. Yeah. And that's what it is. So if you ask me, heart disease, atherosclerosis, is basically a lack of energy. And the first place that's going to lose it is the vascular system, which is why heart disease is the number 1 killer in the world. It's the most prevalent disease. Guess what number 2 is? Cancer. Right? Because if you start to lose it from the vascular system, what's next? The cells. When they lose their voltage, we have an issue. So it's all about inadequate energy. Yeah. And other mechanisms of impaired healing, I should say too. So that has to do with circadian rhythm and things like that. But so anyways, that's number 2. Number 3 is that the structured water also forms around the elements of blood. We're talking lipoproteins, which we have evidence that there's a zeta potential around the lipoproteins and around the red blood cells. And basically, it's a negative charge around them, which means there's structured water formed around them, creating this negative charge. And we all know that the same negative charge of a magnet doesn't like to stick together. You have to put the opposite side together. So if you have a bunch of negatively charged things floating around the blood, they're not going to come together and stick together, right? They're going to repel each other. So everything stays evenly spaced in the blood, non-coagulative, non-sticky, less viscous. So that's how you really thin the blood, is you create structured water in your arteries. And then if you look at like the thing that confirms all this for me is that you look at the research for sunlight exposure and infrared sauna and grounding and the effects it has on the vascular system and the healing effects it has on the endothelia. It's like, well, that's nobody's put that together. There's no study that's put that together yet. But when you see the effects of structured water and what it can do, and then you see the effects of infrared light, the main thing that builds structured water on the vascular system, now you understand, right? This is how you thin the blood and prevent atherosclerosis. And then for healing, you need other things like optimize your circadian rhythm for more melatonin and insulin signaling and all this kind of stuff. If you want to have repair of the lining of the artery, but that's how you prevent it in the first place. You prevent this clotting from happening. And that's completely independent of lipids, that idea. And I love the quote by Buckminster Fuller. He says, you don't change something by fighting the existing reality. You change something by creating a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Right. And so that's just a theory of mine. Right. And that's how I've put everything together. But I also tested that theory on myself. And guess what? I did something medicine said was impossible. Right. For a type 1 diabetic, especially. Right. I reversed plaque in an artery. Right. So that's worth noting.
No, it's absolutely worth noting, man. It's incredible. Correct me if I'm wrong on this. And we might be jumping ahead because I wanted to talk more on fourth phase water and things like this. And we still need to get to the true role of the heart. And I still want to talk about stents, bypasses, things like this as well.
Oh, yeah.
But just since we are already on the topic of fourth phase water, infrared light, how that builds fourth phase water helps increase expand the exclusion zone, which increases the ability to hold that negative charge, which is energy potential. Infrared light is ubiquitous in our environment, like even in a man-made, even in a highly concentrated with a lot of problematic man-made things around us, infrared light is ubiquitous. So it's not that we're not getting infrared light when we're inside. We are still getting it, but the primary form of infrared light that is also accompanied with native EMFs, and I like to, speaking metaphysically and very, I guess you could say esoterically, imbued with the fingerprints of God, is when we're in nature. So it's that we get infrared light in nature, and also we receive negative charge from the earth when we're around the earth, when we're around, just nature itself, we're receiving a lot more negative charge. But it's also that we're not exposed to the pulsed non-native electromagnetic fields and frequencies that are all around us when we're inside as well. And I think that is a big piece when it comes to building negative charge and sustaining negative charge and not destructuring the water in your body. Would you agree with that? What I just said there?
Yeah, I think that when you look at energy flow, right, and how essential that is for something to work, like an electrician will tell you that. Yeah, that's definitely what we need to make something work. The more things you put in the way of that flow, the worse it's going to be. So even if I'm sitting in my infrared sauna inside, like that's a good stimulus. I use that more in the winter. It's helpful. It's more concentrated dose of especially far infrared, the sauna I use, but it's never going to be as good as if I was outside in the sunlight with my feet on the earth, in contact with the Schumann resonance, like as far out as nature as I could be, away from the non-native EMF as I could be. Away from the toxin exposures, which, I mean, for people to want more like scientific validity, Dr. Pollack has shown that glyphosate breaks down structured water, steals charge from the body. He's shown that a wireless router breaks down structured water. I think 15 to 20% reduction in structured water with a wireless router. So yeah, it's legit. Like we're stealing the charge from the body, right. And the more we can recreate a life that gets us back into that situation, where it's more like nature, as close as we can get to it, the better, of maintaining that charge, because that charge is held by structured water.
Right.
And so if you create that, you're giving your arteries a chance.
I want to comment on one thing you said there that I think is such an important point regarding using an infrared sauna and some of these other tools. Like you and I are using these right now, but you just said something that I totally agree with and I think is severely overlooked in this space and just the general health space, but especially in the more, quote, biohacking realm. And I have a lot of problems with that phrase. I did a whole Instagram live on why I have problems with biohacking. But infrared light, infrared sauna, these grounding shoes, things like this, it's not a replacement for nature. It's not a replacement for nature. Again, I look at nature is imbued with the perfect, I guess you could say, essence of God, the creator, source, whatever you want to call it, the universe. And man can only try to mimic that to a certain degree, which will have inevitable inherent flaws because we don't know all of the things about this intricate canvas that was created by God, source, creator, universe, consciousness, whatever you want to call that. And because we don't know that, whatever we make is going to be imperfect relative to that which was created by God. Not that we can't create effective things to help, let's say, mitigate the effects of some of the harmful things that are created by man. Perfect example is these glasses that you and I are wearing, right? Infrared saunas. There's so many things, but it's not a replacement for nature. It cannot be a replacement for nature. And getting as close as we can to the natural world on a consistent basis is going to be the best thing for our health. Would you agree with everything that I said there?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this morning I found a waterfall in Texas and I drove to it and I got in it under the sunlight. I got in the water, immersed myself in water. So yeah, I'm all about that. I think that as often as I can do that, it's the best thing for me. I also work with clients who are never going to do that.
Yeah.
Or myself, like I can't be in that environment all day long. And even then it was outside of a city, it wasn't like totally immersed in nature. So yeah, these tools we've created, we can use them appropriately, I should say, so that we can help, like a grounding mat, right? We can stay grounded, and there's maybe issues with dirty electricity depending on where you live and that kind of stuff. But if you rule out those things and you use a grounding mat and it helps you feel better, maybe one day you won't need it anymore, and you can just go outside or whatever. So there's lots of different things. But one example I give with this is anything that I can give to people to help them get over the hump, So, for most people, they're not going to be able to go spend their whole day outside in infrared light from the sun, because the sun is 40 to 50% infrared light anytime that it's up. So what I can do is help them get some more infrared light exposure, because we're so deficient in it these days. Because fluorescent light doesn't have any, LEDs don't have any, that kind of stuff. We are still getting some infrared. Yeah. Our body makes infrared. Right. We're emitting it right now, but not as much as we should be. And so, but there's going to be a bell curve, right? And I tell people this all the time, because people with their red light panels and their infrared saunas and all this stuff, and they're like, "Oh, blue light is bad and red light is good." I'm like, no, it's all good if it comes in a full spectrum of light. Yes. That's the way that it's supposed to be. So the sun is always going to be best. And by the way, the studies that show that UVB light causes cancer were done on genetically modified mice shining just UVB light on them, which is never the way it would come in nature, right? So you can't say that UVB light causes cancer. Matter of fact, there's studies that show that it doesn't, and that lack of UVB is associated with more cancer, which are just associational studies, but still. So anyways, like with red light, the reason that people get so much benefit from it, or the studies show that there's benefit from it, is because we're so deficient in it.
Yeah.
But you could overdo it. Just like an LED light is very high in processed blue light, and we're overdoing it these days with the screens and the LED bulbs and stuff. If we had chosen red light to be what we powered everything with, we would be thinking, oh, red light is so bad because it would be causing an imbalance. And it's funny, like on like low level light therapy, like laser therapy and stuff like that. Which chiropractors love their low level light therapy. So I go to conferences and chiropractic conferences, and they're talking about there's a threshold. Like you get this benefit, and then it maxes out, and then it's harmful, right? And we see that with those therapies. And so it would be the same thing. You could if you sat in infrareds on all day, it would probably be harmful to you, not only because you get dehydrated, even though you're structuring water, like you would lose so many electrolytes. That's a problem. But yeah, like we have to be conscious about that. But it doesn't mean that there's not tools we can use to, again, get somebody over the hump who's really struggling, make them feel better, help them recreate within our modern world an environment that's more closer to nature.
Trying to mimic as best we can.
Until they feel better, and then they can go do it, go get out into it. Yeah.
A perfect example of that is like some of these devices that I don't like calling them water structuring devices because I'm pretty strict when it comes to terminology as of late, because it's not actually structured water that we're drinking. We're not drinking gel water anywhere.
100%. You're the only other person that's ever said I've ever heard say that.
It's an important distinction, man. It's not structured water. It's completely different than what is actually structured water, which is this fourth phase easy water that's inside our bodies, or when water is exposed to hydrophilic surfaces. We're not drinking gel. But the point is, you could say that it's more coherent water or energized water. I've heard it called other things. Larger point that I'm trying to make here is the best source of water is water that's in a stream in nature, that is going through rocks and minerals, and that is going through this natural flow process and vortexing naturally through this natural process. And there are devices that you can buy that, as best as they can, try to mimic that. But again, it's still not going to be a replacement, but it is something that's beneficial if you live in the city, or if you live in the suburbs or something like this, or if the spring around you, unfortunately, has been polluted by glyphosate because it's right next to a golf course and there's a bunch of runoff from that there. So the point is that we can still use these things to have certain positive effects in our life, for sure.
If it's a device that you need to use to get you a little bit closer to what it is, then it's worth it. Yeah. And that's the I guess the take home is that it is worth using those things as long as you use them responsibly. You don't overdo it. Yes.
Yeah. The one point that I wanted to make, and then I want to get into bypasses, the true role of the heart, and things like this, is we were talking off camera, and I think we should probably reiterate this too. And I've mentioned this before on a couple of other episodes, but I think it's worth hitting again. It's interesting that the Hadza people in Africa, and several friends of mine that I know who live, let's say, a much more natural, almost... It's sad that I would even use this word, but for lack of a better term, extreme lifestyle than I do. Like, you would never, they don't have a cell phone. They're like, F that, I will not have a cell phone. I will never have one. Don't have Wi-Fi in their house. And I really respect that. And it's up to the individual to choose what is best for them. Like, I like having a cell phone so that I can communicate my message with people, but using it in moderation. But point being, like the Hadza people in Africa, these people that I know barely drink water, like barely drink any water whatsoever. And it's interesting because when I think about it, I think like the earth produces primary water, I think our bodies, and you highlighted that it's likely the mitochondria, is producing our own primary water, making water inside of our bodies. And I think that when we're exposed to harmonious, natural EMFs, and we are exposed to, let's just say, nature, we don't need to drink as much water because the water in our bodies is maintaining its integrity and maintaining its structure. So we don't have to have that turnover of introducing more water as much as we would when we're in a more modern environment. Would you agree with that mostly?
Definitely. And I think it's for a few reasons. One, if we have poor metabolic health, we're not making as much of that metabolic water.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's what we're all taught. Like, at least I was, in cellular physiology, electron transport chain, like the end products are ATP. Oh, that's the most important, right? That's all that matters. But then there's all these byproducts, like a reactive oxygen species, which is also very important. Metabolic water, which is also very important. Perfect, structured deuterium depleted water is made from that. And infrared heat. Those are all the byproducts. Those are just waste products. It's like, nope, that's what actually sustains life, those things, ATP's only job is to unfold proteins. But yeah, so the more metabolically healthy we are, the more metabolic water we're going to make. So we're going to make that internally. Also, you're mentioning off camera too, like how sometimes we got to get rid of toxins. So the more toxic you are, like the more water you're going to have to release to where the toxins are dissolved in to get rid of it. So that means the more water you're going to have to replace. Also, the more structured water you have in your body, that's going to stick. It's going to stay there, right? So then you're not going to need to replace as much water. But the more times you're going to have to take some of that structured water and use it to get rid of toxins, the more you're going to have to replace. So there's lots of these different things that are, because if you think about it, because I've thought about that too. Like if I lived in the woods, the perfect environment, no EMS around me, I was eating the right food, everything, like I'm not going to go back to the stream 8 times a day to get a cup of water.
Right.
That's a lot of work. And it wouldn't make sense that humans would have had to do that.
Right.
Or that animals do that. Yes, they do go drink water sometimes, but it wasn't the amounts that we feel like or told that we need today. But it all depends on the state of the person. And I think that I was in a very dehydrating environment when I look back. My circadian rhythm was very disrupted, surrounded by EMFs, lack of sunlight, lack of grounding. I was eating a good diet and I was exercising, but that's about it. And so that contributed to what was going on, what went on with me, why that happened. Because then I was not only lacking water, but lacking structured water.
Yeah.
And that predisposed me to a clotting event, like we talked about, that it doesn't thin the blood very well. And then also, then that stress happened. We got some acute damage to the artery. And then I did a very acutely inflammatory thing, so to speak, that's supposed to be like hormetically stressful better, which is an exercise, and boom.
Yeah.
I got this clotting response in the artery under the most pressure of any artery in the body. That's where it happened.
So it was a combination of you were engaging in things, stress, just your environment in general, that destructured the water of your body. And because the water of your body was being so severely destructured and you weren't introducing adequate water to replace that, and then you had an acutely stressful situation. It was a combination of all those factors that ultimately checks out to me.
Yeah.
Totally makes sense.
It's like, it's never one thing.
Yeah.
People say, what caused this? I'm like, well, it's multiple things.
Right.
And it was probably months in the making.
Yeah.
But yeah, all I can do is learn about it and learn from it, and then try and help others avoid that.
Yeah. Amen. Well said. All right, let's get back. We just went off on a long tangent there. I think helpful though, very helpful and like very intriguing to me. But let's talk about stents, bypass. We touched on blood thinners and statins a little bit, but let's talk about stents and bypasses as well now.
Yeah. So, people will go into Western medical world and they'll get some imaging done. They'll get a CAC score or whatever, and they'll be told, yes, you have this stenosis. And if it's bad enough, this narrowing of an artery, if it's bad enough, they'll say, okay, well, we need to do, a heart cath, and look at things in there. And if it's bad enough, we'll place a stent. Or if it's really that bad, we won't even do that. We'll just do open heart surgery and do a bypass. We'll take a vein from somewhere and bypass that area. And those procedures are done all the time, right? And those procedures are very profitable. And I know that because when I got the hospital bill, the stent alone, just the stent, was $25,000.
Wow.
Yeah. I want to know what that stent's made of.
Wow.
But anyways, you should have seen the total bill. But
what is a stent made of, actually? That's also interesting.
They make them, I don't know exactly what the material is, but they make them of these, they say drug-eluting type materials. These things that are supposed to be, supposed to be like, not prevent or not create clotting as much, but they still do because clotting is not about like a reaction to that. It's a little bit about reaction to that thing that's foreign.
Yeah.
But it's more about disrupting blood flow.
Yep.
And if you got something in there that's disrupting blood flow or creating more turbulent blood flow, then it's going to create a situation where there's more clotting. So, yeah. So, however, there's research of a few different guys. One of them's name is Giorgio Beraldi, and he researched and did autopsies of hearts his entire career. He probably did thousands of autopsies of hearts. And he's the guy that if you go to those Body World exhibits and you see like, there'll be like a fish or some organ where there's like the entire arterial structure of it, he invented the technique to do that.
Got it.
So he would inject some plastic or neoprene material into the arterial system, and then it would harden and then he would dissolve all the tissue around it with hydrochloric acid or something like that.
Kind of like when people put aluminum in anthills and then it hardens.
Exactly. Yeah. Same kind of idea.
Yeah.
And so he was left with these perfect casts of the arterial system of the heart. And what he found was that anytime that, well, first of all, he studied people, he did this on people who didn't have heart attacks, didn't die of a heart attack. He did it on people who did die of heart attacks. And he found curious things. One, he found in people who did die of heart attacks, he found that the stenosis or the blockage that caused the heart attack was nowhere near where the heart tissue death happened. Somewhere totally different in the heart. Another thing he found was that anytime that the artery got to about 60, 70% narrowed, there was the body built collaterals around it. Collateral meaning like it built new arteries from one side of that stenosis to the other. And so, and he said that happened 100% of the time. Anytime it was like, he never found an artery that was 60 or 70% narrow that didn't have it, but he found some with 50% narrowing that didn't have those collaterals. And, you know, I've had cardiologists tell me that some people had collaterals, some people don't. And broadly found that it happened every single time. And I've had cardiologists tell me that they can't form very fast. And I found studies that at least in animals, that they can form within 4 days and completely supply the heart with blood that it needs to. So this gradual stenosis theory, this narrowing, and then it slowly blocks like that, doesn't really hold water because the body will build collaterals. And sometimes the collaterals form well enough that we have case studies of people running marathons on 100% blockage.
Wow.
So like, technically there's no blood going to that area of the heart, but the collaterals are so robust that they can run a marathon. But then sometimes they only form well enough to keep somebody alive. But still, if they exert themselves, then they still may get some chest pain or something like that. You know, there's not that many collaterals. And what dictates how well the collaterals form seems to be how active somebody is.
Got it.
So if they're more active and there's more blood demanding, the more collaterals will form, the body will respond.
Cool. Basically like alternate routes being formed.
Yeah. If you look at all these like autopsies and you can see the little thing, looks like a little Medusa head. There's just arteries everywhere.
Wow.
There's so many. It's like anywhere from I think 7 to 33 different anastomoses is what they're called.
Wow.
So yeah, they form in everybody or anytime there's the stenosis. But then that explains why. When you look at, and I'm not the only one talking about this, there's many cardiologists that talk about this. There's many published papers by cardiologists who talk about this. When you look at the studies on elective stent placements, so these are stent placements that people do that when there's no heart attack occurring, they just went in, they did a heart cath and like, oh, this is pretty blocked, we're going to put a stent in there. Those procedures or a bypass surgery where they do open heart surgery. If you look at the long-term outcomes of those procedures, and I've yet to find a study that shows that they prevent heart attacks. Whether you have the procedure or not, you're just as likely to have a heart attack.
Wow.
And to me, it's because of two things. They show that. Because one is that if the collaterals are already there, then doing a bypass isn't really going to do much, right? The body's already taking care of it. Or putting a stent in there. You know, that may open some things up and create some more blood flow in the main artery again, but the collaterals were already there. And lots of times people will say, well, yeah, but then I had angina before, and after it, I didn't. But there's actually some evidence that they've cut nerves when they do it. So the angina may be gone because you just cut a nerve.
You just don't feel.
And I found that in one particular article. So that's that side of things. The other side of things is that, well, and then we showed what clotting is. So the reason that those procedures don't prevent it is because the body's already taken care of it, and Western medicine has done nothing to prevent clotting. Right? They may give them a blood thinner, but that's a biochemical way of preventing clotting. Right. That's not a blood flow, maintenance of blood flow way of preventing clotting, which is the structured water and that kind of stuff. They've done nothing to prevent that.
It's not addressing the root cause ultimately.
Exactly. Yeah. So the plaque continues to develop, and we're more at risk for a spontaneous clot. So, but that does suggest that if, let's say someone has a 50% blockage and there's no collaterals yet, then a spontaneous clot could form, and a smaller one would now be enough to cause an issue. So those are the most dangerous ones to me. But regardless, placing a stent in that one has not been shown to be beneficial as far as preventing a heart attack, because again, they didn't address the issue, which is the clotting response that can happen. This, or also like if plaque forms in an area and the blood has to flow around it. We've all seen blood or water flow past a rock in a river, and it goes into eddies on the other side. That's creating turbulent blood flow, which you get into the wrong situation, that's a risk for clotting, right? We're interrupting blood flow, which is what happened in my leg. Interrupted blood flow, like it was coming down past that device, and it was just kind of going, and it was swirling, and it was sitting right in this area for too long, right?
Did it feel like there's tremendous pressure on that area specifically?
No, I never feel anything there. It was just the restriction of flow into my leg that I eventually felt. It was just the plaque forming in there. But yeah, that's what does that. So that's the stents and bypasses. The other idea is plaque ruptures. They say that there's soft plaque. So like for a CAC score, for me, mine was 0. There was no hard plaque. But some people have really high hard plaque scores, and that's stable, so to speak. And they're actually using statins have been shown to increase the calcification. And so they're using that as a justification for statins, like, oh, it's going to create more stable plaque, which is less dangerous. But there's still soft plaque that like a CAC score can't pick up. You'd have to get a heart cath, or there's this new Clearly scan that people get that can tell you more about soft plaque. But the soft plaque is said to be vulnerable because it can rupture, it can break. And so there's this paper published in 2015 that's, as far as I'm concerned, largely ignored by cardiology, called The Myth of the Vulnerable Plaque, written by MD PhDs, right? And basically they went through all the evidence of this plaque rupture theory, and they said, yes, plaque ruptures do happen, but they rarely, if ever, cause heart attacks. So
just describe a plaque rupture real quick, what that is, because I actually don't know.
Yeah, so like if there's a plaque on the lining of an artery, just kind of this clotting tissue, a bump there.
It'll rupture the artery itself?
No, it'll part of that plaque will be so unstable and inflamed or whatever that it will break.
Got it.
And when it breaks, that acute inflammation causes a clotting response.
Got it. Okay.
And that clotting response, which all that is true, that does happen according to this paper and all the literature that they reviewed. It does happen, but all it does is it ruptures, creates a clotting response, and that heals they call it a fibrous cap.
Got it.
That kind of heals over that spot. And that can lead to more progressive atherosclerosis and more narrowing of the artery, right? But in their paper, their number was 0.06% of the time does it cause a heart attack.
Wow.
Which is essentially never.
Yep.
So it just kind of builds it up like that. And in the paper, they say that they go on and on about how instead of focusing on the lesion and lesion-based treatment, a bypass surgery, an elective stent placement, instead of doing that, we should be focusing on decreasing risk of clotting. That's what they say. I couldn't believe it. I was just like, yes, that's what I'm saying. They go over on and on about that.
But when they say decreasing risk of clotting, what do they say are the ways to decrease risk of clotting, or do they even go into
They don't analyze it. All they look at is the literature that shows that atherosclerosis is a clotting response.
Yep.
And there's even studies out there.
That's where it can get unfortunate, I'd imagine, if they're still buying into the idea that cholesterol is ultimately the cause, because then they'll say, okay, to decrease risk of clotting, we need to decrease cholesterol, don't eat as many fats, maybe get on some blood thinners, probably use some statins, things like this.
If they did mention that, I don't remember it.
Yeah.
So it must have been very small if they did, because I was so focused on the fact that they were highlighting clotting.
And I don't know that they did or didn't, but my point is like that's what the conventional paradigm says is the way to.
But their focus is maintaining adequate blood flow dynamics. That's the real important thing. And there's studies, but just one researcher named Sloop, who's been really adamant about this, saying that like this is a blood flow change, a blood flow dynamic interruption disease. That's what this is, because when you do that, you create stagnant blood, which is more likely to get a clotting response or a clotting signal to happen. So this is blood flow changes. And so what causes blood flow? We've discussed this, right? It's infrared light, structured water. What have we removed from our environment? Lots of infrared light, lots of sunlight, lots of grounding, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that we've seen this rise. We've taken away the protection. And so they focus on the lesions not being what we should be focusing on. But that's exactly what cardiology does. Every test, every diagnostic procedure they look at is focused on detecting a lesion. Because if they detect it and it's bad enough, they can treat it. And the way they treat it is incredibly profitable. We're placing elective stents and doing bypass surgeries. But the long-term studies on those things don't prevent heart attacks. It's the same thing. I'm sure you've heard of Sean Baker.
Yeah.
And how he got his license taken away because he was preventing doing replacement surgeries, like joint replacement surgeries on people by changing their diet and changing their lifestyle. And they got mad at him because he was costing the hospital lots of money.
Insane,
Right.
man.
So if a cardiologist went in and started doing that, preventing bypass surgeries and things like that, they'd probably lose his license somehow. They would figure this out some way because it's not profitable for the hospital system.
Yeah.
And that's just the way that it's set up. That's just the system that it is. So that's kind of the spiel on stents and bypasses and those types of things.
No, it's helpful as context. Okay, so now to the big question. This is my favorite part, I'd say. And we're going to get into, after this, probably some more metaphysical stuff too. But so we already analyzed the claim that the heart is a pump. Not possible. We don't have pumps in our legs. Went into fourth phase water and how that relates to blood flow, helping the blood move using infrared light, et cetera, increasing negative charge, all the things we just discussed. But what is, in your understanding, the true role of the heart?
Yeah. Yeah. So if the heart's not a pressure propulsion pump moving the blood around the body, then what does it do? Why is it there? Well, there's three roles, distinct roles that I think that the heart plays. One is that, in a way, it is sort of responsible for the movement of blood, just in a very different way than we think. Mm-hmm. And that's because it is a vortex. So there's many ways that Dr. Pollack in his lab at University of Washington has found that you can energize water enough so that it becomes structured water more readily. And one of those ways is to vortex the water, and along with infrared light and various other things. But that makes sense when we think about nature, because water is always moving. And when water becomes stagnant, like in a pond, it kind of gets dirty, and I wouldn't want to swim in a pond as well as I'd want to spin in a river or swim in a river. And so water is always, flowing in rivers, crashing on the beach, tidal currents, evaporating, precipitating. It's moving. Nature is moving water. And it's moving it in a way that's not just laminar, right? It's swishing it around. Mm-hmm. And so the body is a bunch of laminar tubes that are not really creating much turbulence to structure the water, to energize the water. And so we need something that'll do that. And if you look at the heart, it's exactly that mechanism. So evidence for this is there's this researcher in Spain, Francisco Torrent Quasp, who's now since passed, but others have taken up his work. And he found that the heart is actually one big band of muscle, right? That's kind of wrapped up on itself. Yeah. And so when like the heart, the electrical system of the heart sends that signal, it kind of wraps it around because it's wound up on itself. And so when the heart contracts, it spirals like this. Not only that, but when blood flows into the chambers of the heart, it comes in a vortex. It's kind of like when you put like that things you do as a kid, like you put a quarter down and it goes around slowly, it kind of does that. So when the blood flows in, it does that. But also the blood moving through valves, it kind of eddies on the other side. So the heart is there to interrupt the flow of blood, to create this turbulence, to vortex it and structure it. And Dr. Pollack found that when you do this in the presence of oxygen, so like when water is in the presence of oxygen, which the blood always has oxygen with it, even if it's venous blood, it's still about 50% oxygenated, then it will energize the water around it. And so then when that water in the blood and the blood itself leaves the heart and gets out to the periphery, it's more energized so that it can structure itself. When you breathe, the point of that is not necessarily to bring in oxygen. It's to release energy. Yeah. It's basically a charged molecule that's giving us energy. That's why you need it in an electron transport train to transfer energy, but also it's giving energy to the water. So in the presence of oxygen,
you've read Dr. Pollack's paper that he just put out on that recently. Yeah.
And so that's why we're breathing, so that we energize the water in the blood, so that when it vortexes, it becomes really energized and structured, so that when it gets in the periphery, it can move the blood. So in a way, the heart is responsible for moving the blood, but it can't do that on its own. Mm-hmm. Like it wouldn't be, like if we were just living in a terrible environment, like it wouldn't be able to sustain that on its own. Yeah. Right. Which I think contributes to heart failure. Mm-hmm. Whenever we do rely on it too much to do it on its own because our environment is so wrong, then that's one thing that can contribute to heart failure. So that's the first role of the heart, is the vortex blood. The second role is that if I was to exercise, which many people do, The tissue, the demand for energy and nutrients of my muscles and tissues would be so great that all the blood would rush over to the arterial side trying to deliver it, right? And so if the heart wasn't there to actually slow the flow of blood, then all the blood would rush over to the arterial side and the venous side would collapse. Mm-hmm. And if that happened, we would die because that pressure would drop and then the whole system would just suspend and we would die. And so there's actually some very eloquent studies that show that in endurance athletes, the reason that the heart hypertrophies is because it's more effective at slowing the flow of blood.
Which is the exact opposite of what people would think.
They did it in soccer players, and so that's why the heart gets bigger, because it's like a bigger catcher's mitt. Yeah, to catch the flow of blood and then vortex it and bring it and get it out. So that's why the muscle gets bigger. But it's actually slowing the flow of blood. And then in Dr. Branko's first book, he highlights studies. His book's called The Heart and Circulation. He highlights studies where they show that like the effectiveness of the slowing of how effective it's vortexing and slowing the flow of blood is an indicator of how good the heart function is. Mm-hmm. Right? Those are better indicators of how good our heart is functioning. And that if it actually gets to be too much, the heart just gets out of the way. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem. We don't want the heart to get out of the way because then the blood is free for all going. So it's just like, it's the heart, like when you exercise and your heart rate increases, that's not the heart moving more blood. It's the heart trying to keep up with the tissue demand that's driving the blood in one certain direction. And if it gets to be too much, then the heart kind of stops and it kind of becomes a little bit arrhythmic and just kind of, and then lets the blood move through. And that's a problem. We don't want that to happen. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so that's the second role, is there to slow the flow of blood during exertion so we don't have a venous collapse and die. And then the third role of the heart is to measure coherence. And people have called this many different things. But the heart has the largest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. And it's what gives an organ its electromagnetic field is its mitochondrial content, which has to do with, when you create an electromagnetic field, it's like energy passing, which is like protons one way, electrons one way. That's creating an electromagnetic field. That's what electron transport chains do. That's what mitochondria do. And the more concentration of mitochondria you have, you're going to have a bigger electromagnetic field created from that. And the heart, the brain, and the eyes have some of the highest mitochondrial content in the entire body. So why is the heart's field so much bigger? Because they all have similar amounts of mitochondria. Well, it's bigger than the eyes, easy because the eyes are smaller. And the brain is actually a little bigger than the heart. So the heart's is bigger because I read this book called Nature's Twist by Carl Moore. And he was illustrating how when you add a vortex or a spiral in an electromagnetic field, it amplifies the electromagnetic field. And that's exactly what the heart's doing. It's the only organ in the body, aside from the lungs, that is really moving like that. I mean, the lungs kind of expand and contract kind of slowly. The heart is doing it pretty quick, right? Yeah. And so it's amplifying that electromagnetic field, which means that it's the field that you can detect from the farthest away from the body. And the Heart Math Institute has done a lot of work with this. But that means that it's doing two things, in my opinion. One, it is kind of the organ that we use to reach out and sense our environment, especially our emotional environment, our electromagnetic environment. Mm-hmm. And there's no mistaking the fact that we associate that organ with emotions. Totally. And that we get into someone's heart space or whatever, that kind of stuff. But it's also measuring coherence, or the ability to communicate, or your body's ability to communicate with itself. So cellular to cellular communication, how synced up and communicating your entire body is. Every organ electromagnetically, neurologically, every cell electromagnetically, connective tissue-wise, like how well things are communicating and operating like they should. And if they're not, they're sending a very incoherent signal to the heart, and the heart's picking up on that. Or if our environment outside is very incoherent, or we have something interfering with that incoherence, like a past trauma, or we have an electromagnetic or non-native EMF environment around us, or different artificial lights, or just we're not in contact with the electromagnetic field, like all these different things can interfere with this coherence. And like I was describing to you, I think last night was the first time I've said that, was like, it's almost like you can imagine like the heart's electromagnetic field, like the tentacles that are going out into the environment and kind of sensing things and touching and feeling. And so that information that the heart is picking up, it's got that big burden because it's got that big field, is then relayed to the brain electromagnetically, wirelessly, and also neurologically, which we know there are more signals sent to the brain from the heart than from the heart to the brain. And then the brain responds accordingly based on your emotional state, right? And various other things, your coherence. So, and that's measured via heart rate variability. People think that heart rate variability is measuring balance in the autonomic nervous system, but I would say that it's more of a reflection of your autonomic nervous system signaling based on coherence, because the coherence of the heart is usually reflected in better heart rate variability, and then the heart relays that better signal to the brain, and the autonomic nervous system has a more balanced signaling back to the heart or back to the body. So that's kind of how the system works. There's this heart-brain connection, but it's all based off. So the heart is a sensory organ that is picking, and we have way more than 5 senses.
Yeah,
Like our nervous system is just like the brain is just like, I compare it to the postal office. Like they don't change the signal. They shouldn't change the signals that come in. They just read the letter and say, okay, it's going here, and they send it back out there. So if we want to change the way the brain is signaling to the body, we have to change our environment and the signals that it's getting. And one of those big ones, especially emotionally, is heart coherence, and what signals we're sending to our body as far as coherence. And I talk about this a lot in my book I wrote about pain, which just came out this past year, because it's incredibly important for rewiring the brain in people who have chronic pain. But that's like, those are the 3 roles of the heart. And they're incredibly important. And we've talked a few times in the past few days about how there was this ancient wisdom, I feel like. And if you look at all the ancient societies, Sumerian, Egypt, Chinese, India, all those ancient civilizations, they all placed the heart as the seat of the soul, and how it's what we reach out into our environment with. It was all there. And it wasn't until we got more modern science around, I think one of the Greek philosophers was the first to suggest it. We got more analytical and scholarly, I think, and we started getting bigger brains, that I think maybe bigger egos too, and we started thinking that the brain was the center of the soul and of consciousness and all that kind of stuff. And they work together. They do.
Of course.
There's not like there's one that's better than the other or more important than the other. But the heart is where we feel the emotions. Yeah. And that's kind of why, if you look throughout history, it's where all the literature and all the music and everything that's come from that is got this reference to the heart. We say, I love you with all my heart. I gave it all my heart, all that stuff. It's the sensory organ of our emotions. Yeah.
Yeah. It totally makes sense, man. That's where, in several examples of people who have what is known as psychic phenomena, and I have brought this up on a number of episodes now because it really is transformative seeing this. I've had the privilege of seeing 2 different sets of kids read blindfolded, and when you talk with their moms on how they're able to achieve this, both will talk about how it's getting the kids into a very, very strong heart space, like pulling yourself into the heart. And when I practice Qigong regularly, and a big piece of that Qigong practice, you have your lower dantian, you're in your belly, but a big piece of the way I've learned to practice is getting into your heart, is really pointing your inner awareness, your inner light into your heart and pulling yourself there. And I think that when we pull ourselves there regularly and we're getting in nature more, we start understanding and feeling almost like a palpable experience of how interconnected we all are. I think the more that we spend in here, the more we're in this individuated ego state, which has its positive effects, don't get me wrong, right? Like, I'm a pretty critically thinking guy. I love painting things against the scientific method, see if they actually adhere to that. I am very proficient in understanding logical fallacies, but there's this inner knowing that comes from pulling yourself into here. And I think the biggest piece of that inner knowing is how connected we all are and how disconnected we've become because we've been pulled into this so much more, which is why you hear that phrase thrown around so much, especially as of late over the last 5 years, the need for mankind to be pulled back into here. There's something very real about that, because when you're pulled back into here and you're almost thinking from here in a way, you're connecting with that larger electromagnetic field of who and what you truly are, which is a fundamental part of you, which reaches out and touches all the other electromagnetic fields around you and interacts at that level subtly that we can't perceive with our five senses, but is very real. And that's what brings us into this connection. And the more that we do that, like my good friend Eileen McCusick says, strong coherent field overtakes and entrains weaker incoherent fields, brings them into coherence, and then we create concentric rings of coherence. And that's how I think we help pull mankind out of this insane rut that we're in right now.
Yeah, so much to say there. In Plato, like in his allegory of the cave, he talks about like the enlightened being or whatever when he comes out of the cave. And he has this gnosis, he calls it, which is this knowing, right? But the knowing to me is when your heart is connected to that space. Because if you think about it, like, what are people who are like depressed and anxious and they feel inability to connect, right? They feel alone in a crowded room.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, because their heart field is damaged, or like, it's not able to reach out and
it's
connect. Yeah,
it's collapsed.
It's smaller to connect with the ether or the prana or the field or whatever you want to call it. And that field is what connects all of us. And so if you don't have the ability to connect to that, then you feel disconnected from humanity. And that's exactly how we describe to people who are depressed, right? So that's part of what's going on, and that's because the heart's getting incoherent signals from external and internal environment. We're sick internally, and the environment outside is sick. You can say it that way. And so that's reflected in poor heart rate variability, which is poor coherence and a lower field. And then we can't connect. And it's just kind of this cycle that happens. But also you're talking about, these children who were reading with blindfolds on. And there's some really awesome, evidence out there that the memories and the information is not stored here.
Yeah.
It's stored in the collective consciousness, in the ether, whatever you want to call it.
I call the ether, and I could be incorrect on this, it's synonymous with what people refer to in spiritual circles as the Akashic records. It is the information field that we're all existing in, we're swimming in right now.
It's stored out there. Yeah. And like you were describing, humanity has come, and like it even may have started with some of those Greek philosophers. We started to get more scholarly and we started to move up here.
Yeah.
Right. And when we moved up here, we thought all the information was here.
Yeah.
Right. And when we lost this, then humanity lost the ability to do these absolutely fascinating things like build giant pyramids that are exactly aligned with whatever it is in the stars. We lost the ability to do that because we're all stuck in here.
Exactly.
But if we were down here accessing the collective consciousness and all that information, then those kids maybe could read. They don't even need to see. They can just see what's on the page because they're accessing the field.
Yeah.
That's the purpose of the heart that may be the most important.
Right, man.
Right?
Totally.
At least for humanity moving forward. It's fascinating.
Right. Do you think that this is a big question? This is getting a little bit metaphysical, sort of woo-woo esoteric, which I like to get in a lot of my episodes anyway. And ultimately, I knew we were going to end up here. And I still have some other questions related to heart health and so-called heart-healthy foods and things like this. Yeah. We'll circle back. But do you think that the biofield is ultimately the amalgamation of all of the individuated fields of our body, or is it synonymous with the heart's field?
I think that every single organ's field is connected in some way to it.
To the biofield. The biofield is like an amalgamation of all the fields. But ultimately, definitely, we could possibly assume that the heart plays the biggest piece in that total biofield.
Well, the only evidence I have for that, because I think that the only evidence I have for that is because of just the behaviors of humanity.
Right.
Like when people didn't have any modern science or critical thinking, or they had critical thinking, but like modern science to get in the way back in the day, that's what they thought.
Right.
And even today, we say things like lead with your heart.
Yeah.
Listen to your heart. That kind of stuff. It's not, there's no mistake in that.
Yeah, totally.
That's why. Agree. That's why I think that it is the more prominent one. Or maybe it's just the one that the field's big enough that it gets the information first.
Yeah.
That
can make sense because it's extending out for, that makes sense.
Maybe, but then it communicates that to the rest of the body through those fields of the other organs, and those other organs are sensing some of the environment as well. But yeah.
Do you think that the biofield is synonymous with the soul?
I don't know. I think that's subjective because everybody's got a different interpretation of soul.
Yeah.
You know, just like everybody's got a different interpretation of
Like
the higher power.
Let me ask it a different way. Do you think the biofield is ultimately inextricably linked to the body, or that because when the body dies, I would imagine that maybe after a few days, you're not measuring any field coming from that body, at least not to the degree that you were when, that body was alive. In my mind, that implies that because, the biofield ultimately forms because we have an electrical current, and anything that has an electrical current forms a magnetic field. So that's the human biofield, that electromagnetic field, that when the body dies, that electrical current is cut off, and that the biofield quite literally is the soul that ultimately lives on and is eternal. And I know I don't have any evidence to back up this claim, but I've just thought about this quite a bit.
Well, I actually had this conversation with an ex-girlfriend, and I don't know what I think happens when we die.
Yeah.
And I'm perfectly comfortable saying that I don't know. I also fully acknowledge that throughout the history of humanity, humans have told themselves many different things about what happens to either feel better about dying and the uncertainty of it, or to explain what they're seeing in the world today.
Very good point.
And so I think that, so I don't know is my answer.
Yeah.
I could see so many different things that can happen, as far as like the different things that people believe. I wouldn't be surprised if any of them were true or none of them.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be, I'm perfectly willing to accept that I could fall asleep one day and die and never even know or care, because I'm like, when I'm asleep, I've never had lucid dreams or like been aware that I was asleep while sleeping. So for me, it's like I could just, but never care that I'm dead.
Yeah.
Because I don't have the ability to think that I'm dead.
Yeah, that's fair.
But my soul could also live on forever.
Yeah.
And be passed on or reincarnated or whatever you believe. I'm ready for it. Like, let's see what happens.
I love that openness.
Yeah. And like, that's kind of the way that's kind of the way I am about everything, is because just being open-minded. And like, some of my biggest critics are like, well, you're a chiropractor. you're not a cardiologist, whatever. And that's the stupidest argument in the world. But it's like, maybe that's my benefit. Like, maybe that's my advantage, is that I'm not immersed in the world of cardiology. And a lot of the things I'm talking about are not cardiology. They're absolutely not. And I don't want them to be, because obviously cardiology is not working with all these modern advances and all these newer medications. It's still the number one cause of death in the world.
Yeah, right.
And it's actually the last 20 years has gotten worse. People say that it's gone down, but it's actually started to go back up again.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I stay open-minded as I can be and just entertain many things, which is hard for me to do sometimes. It's a hard thing to do because I feel like I'm correct about a lot of things.
So I totally get where you're coming from
But
on that, man.
I have to entertain that maybe I'm not.
But ultimately, because I feel the same way too in some respects, I think this also applies to you. It's that you have sufficiently falsified all of the claims that they make about what is, and you're just presenting other possible explanations based on your own direct experience and observation and looking into the research. But you're still maintaining that openness. And ultimately what led you to that position in the first place was because you were so open.
Yeah. And
you know what I mean? That's a really big point, because people are like, sorry, go ahead.
This is a perfect heart-related example.
Yeah.
Of what you just said, or remaining open, or not being, or being uncertain about something.
Yeah.
I don't know that my heart attack was caused by a blockage or not caused by a blockage. Like, I don't know which one it was. And so like Tom Cowan pointed out to me at the Wise Traditions conference a few months ago, or 3-4 months ago, he pointed out, he was like, well, you don't know that blockage wasn't there before they did the heart cath. And he's right. I don't know. I have no idea if it was there or not. Maybe it was there. It's hard for me to believe, again, like a full blockage formed and none of it calcified, so the CAC score showed up 0. That's hard for me to believe. I also know that when they put the enzymes in there to bless the clot and place the stent and open the artery, my symptoms immediately went away. So that's kind of these things that I'm seeing in my head, but I don't know.
Yeah.
It could have been these other mechanisms by which heart attacks can occur without a blockage, which we didn't get into specifically. We mentioned it. But it can happen, and it's been shown to happen. They call them Minoka's heart attacks. It could have been that, and the blockage was always there, right? But when they intervened, whatever they did, but it could have been the morphine that they gave me that caused me to stop having that autonomic nervous system imbalance signaling to the heart. It relaxed me, and then I stopped having the heart attack symptoms. It could have been that. I don't know.
Right.
And I'm open to either one. So then people are like, well, how do you know what to do then? And one of my favorite quotes is by F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he says, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. And what that means to me is, I'm not saying I'm intelligent or anything. I'm just saying that like it's when you can hold two ideas like that in your mind and you still wake up in the morning and you know what you're going to do. That's that empowerment I used, like when we talked in the beginning of the podcast, like when I understand something, it takes away its control of me because then I know how to live my life, right? So regardless of if it was that Minoka heart attack without a blockage or if it was the blockage, I know how I'm going to prevent both.
Yeah.
And I'm going to do those things. I'm going to wake up. I'm going to get as much sunlight as possible. I'm going to ground, which are all going to create coherence and better autonomic nervous system signaling, but it's also going to create more artery health and blood flow and that kind of stuff. So it's like the answer is the same.
Yeah.
And whether or not, no matter what it was, you know, it doesn't matter.
The answer is to get back to nature either way.
Right. Yeah. So that's how I feel about a lot of different things as far as staying open-minded and just having different ideas in your head. Like, it could be either one. And I can prove this one's wrong, but then I don't even know what the answer is. I don't need to have an answer.
Falsification doesn't require replacement.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes. And then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. At this point in history, community is essential, and as the world shifts in ways we never imagined, finding spaces that foster true connection with like-minded people is more important than ever. Join us this year for our third annual Confluence Festival, May 7th through the 12th in Bandera, Texas. Confluence is a transformational gathering where a like-minded community comes together on a stunning regenerative farm just outside of San Antonio, offering the perfect opportunity to connect deeply with nature, paradigm-shifting knowledge, and one another. With multiple offerings running simultaneously, Confluence features a dynamic mix of lectures, workshops, live music, movement classes, and more, covering topics from circadian biology and consciousness to dome building and regenerative agriculture. Attendees are encouraged to CYOA, choose your own adventure, ensuring a truly personalized experience. This year, we are so stoked to welcome Dr. Diane Hennessy-Powell, a leading neuroscientist featured in the viral Telepathy Tapes podcast series, sharing her research on the science of telepathy and expanded consciousness. Dr. Gerald Pollack will reveal his groundbreaking work on the fourth phase of water, reshaping how we understand biology and energy. We'll also be joined by Dr. Kelly Brogan, Eileen McCusick, Veda Austin, Tom Barnett, and many, many more incredible workshop leaders and lecturers. Plus, we'll have live musical performances from Lincoln Jesser, Headflux, DJ Mike Winter, Joel Raffiti, and several other incredible musicians and performers. And when it comes to nourishment, we believe food is medicine. I promise you will not find better food at any event you attend. The full-scale restaurant on site serves farm-to-table meals with ingredients grown and raised right on the property or sourced from local farms, providing a deeply nourishing experience for both body and spirit. And our event accommodations are designed for every comfort level. Camp under the stars, stay in a cozy tiny home, enjoy luxurious glamping, or park your RV. If you prefer a hotel, we've got you covered with nearby hotel options as well. And your whole family is welcome. Our unschooling village, led by experienced guides, provides engaging activities for kids aged 2 through 12, ensuring that parents can fully immerse themselves in the experience while their little ones learn and play in a supportive environment. Come be a part of an unforgettable event surrounded by like-minded community where we gather in celebration of health, freedom, and coherence. Visit confluenceevent.com or head to the show notes to learn more and reserve your spot today. So because you brought up how heart disease, heart attacks seem to be increasing, like what that immediately triggered in my mind is the products, let's say. This is crazy because I just did an episode with Leslie Manukian that came out, and we made a point to not say the V word. We just said products the whole episode. And
Voldemort?
Yeah, Voldemort. He who must not be, it's funny because it's also another form of he who must not be named. It that must not be named on YouTube. But funny enough, like we did not say the word. Maybe she accidentally said it once, but the point is, before it even premiered on YouTube, YouTube took it down and we weren't even saying the word. Wow. We were saying product the whole time. So I don't know how much more careful I can be. It is what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we won't say the C word either. we're gonna try to skirt around this as much as we can.
Give me requirements here.
I know. I'm sorry, but okay. The products that came out over the last 4.5 years that many people made the decision through fear or in some cases through coercion to receive, and also funny enough, and we know correlation doesn't equal causation, but there seems to be a lot more heart-related events the last 4.5 years. And I know you wrote an article on this topic. I'll link that in the show notes. And maybe if you're not catching on with what we're talking about, first I would question whether you've been living under a rock or listening to this podcast at all ever. But if you're still confused, just scroll down the show notes, look at that article, and you will see what it relates to what we're talking about right here. So yeah, just your opinion on that in general.
Yeah, I do think it's a contributor. But I never look at one thing and say it's caused by one thing.
Right.
Whether that's a disease process or some observation we're seeing in statistics or something.
I really appreciate that, by the way, because I've often said the same thing, that I think as a result of many things in Western medicine, maybe it's just a tendency of human beings to think one single thing is the cause of another single thing. And that's what's ironic. I don't think that the scientific method can ever actually be strictly adhered to, but if they're making the claim that the scientific method requires these things, and they're making the claim that this single thing in any capacity is the cause of another single thing,
yeah.
Especially if they're going to try to coerce the world to do certain things related to that, they better adhere to the scientific method. But the point is, because we as human beings can't know all of the physical and metaphysical factors at play when it comes to all of the various factors that go into the production of any given effect, we're never going to be able to truly adhere to the scientific method, and it just is what it is.
Yeah. Well, and this is a really important point to make for me, is that so many people. So I spoke at Dave Feldman's conference last year, and I only had 15 minutes to talk. So I
you covered a lot in that 15 minutes. By the way, I watched that video.
I tried to do as best I could. But yeah, the video is done very well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people have watched it. It's done the best of any of the talks there at the conference. But in the comments, if you go down, people are so quick to say, well, the safe and effective did that to a lot of people. And it's just like, did you even ask if I received said product?
Right.
And the answer is no,
right.
I didn't. And they weren't even available when this happened to me.
Right.
So don't be so quick to assign it to one thing, especially if you don't have all the information.
Totally.
But even if you did, like, even if I did have it, like, we can't say that was it. And you can't, because because in people's minds, it's easier to be black and white like that.
Totally.
You can just say, well, I can explain this because of that.
Well, what it creates the effect of is people then are glued myopically to that being the only possible cause, then overlooking the countless other things in our environment.
That means I don't have to change my life.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it means.
I mean, here's a perfect example. What also occurred over the last 4.5 years, and I think this is mostly the case across the board. I'll even say for me, as much as my life has gotten better in the last 4.5 years, there are moments in time where I was in a perpetual state of stress. And I think it's the same for a lot of people. And, maybe people weren't scared of the so-called, particle that was allegedly floating about, but they were likely scared of government tyranny or scared of losing their job or scared of what their friends and family thought at various points in times. And we know that is also a contributing factor. And then likewise, we're inside so much more over the last 4 years for a lot of people than people were previously. The parasitic class, if that's what you want to call them, were so clever in getting even those of us who are holistically leaning to be inside on these devices more. And it's such a catch-22 because it's also allowed us to connect. I wouldn't have met you if it weren't for them. I wouldn't have this podcast if it weren't for these devices. But ultimately, they also have negative effects on our physiology, on our health, and ultimately on our heart, as we've discussed throughout this whole episode. So it's not just those one single things over the last 4.5 years. I know plenty of people who never received those things and also have had heart issues and heart-related events over the last 4.5 years. And so I think it's a combination of all those factors.
Yeah, for sure. And it's always a combination of multiple things. And the solution is almost always a combination of multiple things too.
Exactly.
Right. So as far as like if someone was injured, and that's a lot about what the article I wrote was about. It's centered around an individual who healed from it. So yeah.
After being injured by that thing.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. So and the I guess the different steps she had to take, the multiple different things she had to do, and how their first approach didn't work. And then I help explain why it worked in the article. It's the longest article I've ever written. But yeah. So, and actually, in that article, I explain if it was one thing, and if it was this one thing, here's the potential mechanisms of how we could explain the rise in things like myocarditis or clotting. Or cancer or whatever, or anaphylaxis or high blood pressure, which were a lot of the things that people were reporting. And there's actually literature now that shows that, yes, there was an increase and there could have been a relationship between the two.
Totally.
Lots of literature now. I think the last I heard, like up to 1,000 articles published, maybe more now. Anyways, so if I am making a case for that one thing being the cause, I was reading Gilbert Ling's book. I was just kind of reviewing it for some things I was looking up for a presentation I was doing. And I stumbled across the fact that he used ethylene glycol in some of his studies that he was using to test on different cells. And why they use that, I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but they use it often, I think, in cellular research or whatever. And he noticed, especially since he's aware of structured water and things, he noticed that when he would inject ethylene glycol into a cell, at first the cell would shrink, which would suggest more structured water formation at first, but then very quickly after that, it would shrink, and then all of a sudden it would start rapidly expanding, right? So another property of structured water that's interesting is that, when water goes to ice, it expands, which is why when you have water in a glass bottle and you freeze it, it could crack the bottle, right? But when water becomes structured water, it actually gets more compact. And that has to do, I think, with the fact that it's losing a hydrogen. And so it's just a more compact situation. And so if cells are made of structured water, which we know that they are, something we haven't talked about extensively in this podcast, but they are, they're more compact.
Yep. And
so he injected the ethylene glycol, and at first they did kind of constrict, but then very quickly they started to expand. So what was happening? We were losing structured water.
Wow.
And the cell was becoming more liquid water and expanding when it was doing that. So we basically, he kind of concluded that it destroys structured water, or destroys the bound water is what he called it.
Got it.
There's lots of different names. Scientists came across it a lot of different times. So now if we look at one of the most notable ingredients in the products was polyethylene glycol, which is by definition a string of ethylene glycols. So, and if you look up polyethylene glycol on the internet, you'll say that it's in a lot of different products. It can be in toothpaste, it can be a lot of different things, and that the body's actually pretty good at getting rid of it if it's ingested.
This is what it always goes back to, dude.
Yeah, if it's ingested,
always.
like we just kind of get rid of it, it doesn't really get absorbed, and that's fine. It's actually used, it's a laxative, it's in Miralax and stuff like that. But anyway, so we just get rid of it. However, if you bypass that natural way we're supposed to absorb things like that, and you inject it directly, then that we don't get rid of it very well. And so then if we take the evidence from Ling that it destroys structured water, you can start to explain a lot of these things.
Right.
So one thing we can explain is anaphylaxis, or even just a local site reaction, right? There's redness. So if you look at what signals mast cells, which are what release histamine, which gives us that red response, or whatever, the itchy red response, it's a drop in voltage. And the voltage in a cell is held by structured water. So if you inject some polyethylene glycol there, destroy structured water, we start to lose voltage, mast cells become unstable. If that happens systemically, we get anaphylaxis, which can be very dangerous and life-threatening. So that can explain that, right? Good. We already talked about how structured water is incredibly important for preventing clotting. If you inject polyethylene glycol, all of a sudden you're destroying all those structured water mechanisms that prevent clotting, and we can get an increased clotting risk.
Yep.
Right. The other thing is that structured water is not just in cells, and it's not just in the linings of the arteries and things like that. It's also in the extracellular fluid and the spaces between different organs in the body.
Interstitium, is that what that's called?
Interstitium,
Yep.
yeah.
Is that the same as
interstitial
fascia?
fluid?
Is
Interstitium is a word that they used, one word they used to describe fascia.
Okay.
The connective tissue matrix, the tensegrity system, all that kind of stuff. Interstitial fluid would be like the fluid between cells.
Yep.
But I'm also talking about like the fluid between, like, say, well, in this case, the pericardium and the pericardial sac.
Got it.
Like the thing the sheath that surrounds the heart.
Yep.
Right. So, and structured water surrounds fascia too. It's around every single collagen, or it should be around every single collagen fibril. But so when it's there, another property of structured water, it's so amazing that it has all these properties, and it makes so much sense for physiology, is it eliminates friction. So it basically creates this frictionless surface that things can slide around. So like when you ice skate, your skate is not a hydrophilic surface, but the ice underneath it is. And so as your skate slides across that, it's melting the water, the ice, just enough, and that water is becoming structured water. So
it's interesting because that means it's in the middle of a phase change too.
Exactly.
Just like structured water is in between two phases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why your ice skates slide. And we've all had that experience. We pull some ice out of the freezer and it sticks to our finger, but as soon as it starts to melt, it becomes structured water and it slips right out of our hand.
Yep.
Right. There's just absolute loss of friction. And so that's why it's critical for movement of blood through an artery.
Yeah.
But also it lines these spaces. Right. So it eliminates friction. So, and also, like, because of the way the cardiac cells are, they're kind of linked up. They have these intercalated discs that link them together, so that when they expand and contract, they're like accordions, right?
Got it.
And between those bands of accordion-like cells, there's this water, right? Well, what if you eliminate that water? You eliminate that loss of friction. You get inflammation. You get itis. You get myocarditis. You get pericarditis. And that's exactly what happened. Everybody was like, why is it targeting the heart? Because it's happening in the organ that moves.
Wow.
Right? And the lungs, they got pleuritis too. People were getting, but it was just less so because the heart's moving more and faster.
Yep.
Right? So it's not like that it's targeting the heart. It's just that it's destroying structured water, and that's the one that's moving, creating friction.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
That makes so much sense.
Right? And then we haven't gotten into cancer, but yeah, people are reporting higher incidences of cancer and stuff, which we alluded to before. Maybe it was off camera, I can't remember. But
it all blends together.
When you get a loss of voltage of a cell that's bad enough that loss of voltage in a controlled way is what signals for controlled cell division. If you pathologically get a loss of cell voltage, guess what? You get a cell that cannot stop dividing. And there's plenty of literature showing that the loss of cell voltage is what triggers for cancer cells. So again, you inject polyethylene glycol that loses that voltage, we can get these turbo cancers, they're saying. And until you get rid of that substance, you detoxify that substance, then you're going to have this reaction. And so the problem with that is that so many of us in society have detox pathways that are shut down.
Well, it's also that things were not made to be injected into
That's
us.
true.
So
yeah, but then it's systemic, and like even long. Sorry, I said the word.
Good. It's all good.
even
bleep that out.
this perpetual disease process that's happening. If you did contract said thing, it's the same process. I think whether you took the product or got the disease, like it's the same process your body's doing. It's trying to get rid of stuff, right? And you just induced it with a product rather than force your body to do it because of environmental factors. And so the answer is opening up those detoxification pathways. And you can't do that without first charging your body. You've got to get enough charge, just stored in structured water. And then you have to make sure detox pathways are open. And then you have to make sure that your body's getting signals to detoxify. So basically that means putting your body in an environment where you gain charge, and then making sure you're not constipated, make sure you're getting lymphatic flow and blood flow and all these types of things. You're sweating, all those detox pathways are open. And then circadian rhythm. So you have to set your circadian rhythm. You have to increase melatonin production after sunset, because melatonin is what triggers for the cleaning house at night. It signals for everything to just detoxify. Lymphatic drainage, growth and repair, autophagy, mitophagy, all of that happens mostly, or supposed to, when we get into that deep sleep.
So would you say that it's most important, not that it's not important during the day, but it's most important to be mindful of your light environment at night?
Yeah, most important. It's important all day long.
Yeah, of course.
But most important, like if people were just looking for somewhere to start, yes, get some blue blocking glasses, the quality pair of blue blocking glasses, and be conscious of your light environment at night. Change that. That's, like the most low hanging fruit there. Yeah,
makes sense. The one thing that we haven't discussed that I think I want to wrap up with, pending you have any other thing that you want to address, and I hope we don't have to just add a bunch of bleeps for the whole last 10 minutes.
I think that was just one. I think it was my fault, but maybe, I don't know.
But I don't even know if PEG will be something that triggers. Whatever, I don't care though. It is what it is. It's an important message to get out. But the last thing that I want to discuss is diet as it relates to heart health. And I want to preface this by saying my opinion on diet in general has ebbed and flowed so much because I have adopted one paradigm and then I meet multiple people who do the exact opposite approach to that specific paradigm and have maintained health for 10, 20, 30 years. And have even, I know you've probably heard Gerald Pollack talk about this, people who claim to be breatharians. I've interviewed someone who claims to be a breatharian, who don't eat any food whatsoever. They're basically just getting their primary fuel source from the earth, from, you could say, I guess, infrared light in various forms, et cetera, especially knowing that ATP is not the primary mechanism for energy inside of our cells. It's actually all about charge. And so my opinion has always changed, but I always come back to this at the very least. No matter what you choose to eat based on your own individual constitution environment, try to eat locally, try to eat seasonally, and eat organic. That's what it comes back to for me ultimately. So I want to preface this by saying that. Now, with that being said, I also recognize countless examples of people, and I'll even say that I've never been vegan for prolonged periods or anything like that. I want to be clear here. And again, I want to emphasize, I do know people who don't eat any meat whatsoever, any animal products, who've maintained health for quite some time, and it flies in the face of what I previously believed. So with that being said, I know countless people who were either on a vegan diet, even if it was raw, organic, and started after some time experiencing negative health effects, switched back to animal foods and got better. And then of course, people who are on a standard American diet and then switched to eating just exclusively animal products and seem to get better. I know people who were having health issues across the board on various dietary choices that switched to a strict carnivore diet for just some time and reversed a lot of issues that they were dealing with. But then some of those people, after adopting carnivore for too long, started having negative health effects. So they did start to reintroduce some other things. So I know I just threw a lot at you, but these claims surrounding heart healthy foods in the mainstream, I think it's best to start there, since the large portion of this conversation was focused on the heart. Things like Cheerios and things like this, I think it goes without saying that these things are absolutely horrible for your health and probably horrible for your heart. And it's funny that they're labeled as heart healthy, but let's start there first.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, if anything has a label like that, don't eat it. You know, if it says low fat, or if it says heart healthy, or it says low fat, or like weight loss, I mean, like those types of things, like, don't eat that. But
which is so ironic, though. It really is. It's just like a perfect example of the countless examples of a complete 180 inversion of what is actually true.
And the term heart healthy, according to the mainstream academic institutions and government agencies and whatever, is anything that lowers cholesterol or can lower cholesterol, which is why people are taking phytosterol, plant fat, like cytosterol and different things, because when you compete with cholesterol's absorption into the body, you may get lower cholesterol. So phytosterol, like plant fat. Cheerios, you were mentioning, they've been shown to reduce cholesterol, right? Because you're, eating these processed carbohydrates, you're depriving your body
cardboard.
of fat. Yeah, pretty much. And so anything that has been shown to do that is now termed heart healthy, because the dogma is that if your cholesterol is high, you're getting heart disease. You will get heart disease, more likely to get heart disease. And if it's low, you have less risk. And that's it. That's the thing. That's the benchmark that they go off of. And I've read some crazy things in literature where they were testing something like, it wasn't even related to lipids or whatever, but they were doing blood tests as part of the clinical trial. And they were like, well, whatever we were doing, it also lowered LDL, so therefore it's heart healthy what we're doing. It was a kind of an accident reasoning that we found this, you know? And it's just like, what? And it's just like, so, and there's statements in literature I read all the time. It's just like, it has been unequivocally proven that LDL, higher LDL causes heart disease. And it's just like, what? There's, at best, there's just as much literature that shows that it doesn't as there is that does.
Yeah.
So what do you believe?
It's just crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this applies across several health-based and really just scientific paradigms. How many downstream second, third, fourth, fifth gazillion order effects ultimately happen because of the initial flawed but universally agreed upon premise?
Yeah.
Like it's crazy to think about. It just
becomes conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
And then we're at a point where we're having to provide so much evidence that it's not the thing when there was never any evidence that it was the thing in the first place. Like the extent that Dave Feldman is having to go through to show, because his literature and his research is, I think, showing that we should not be focusing on the lipids pretty soundly. We should be focusing on other things. It's just like there's still people that reject it.
Yeah.
And it's just, but there was no evidence that it was in the first place. So anyways, that's just, I try not to get lost in research, because I think that it's a false dichotomy. It's a whole hyper reality, in my opinion. I call it a hyper reality, like something we take as more real than what's actually real.
Yeah, than reality itself.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the Weather Channel, looking at that green blob, you're like, oh, look, it's raining, but you look outside, it's not raining. It's like, what are you going to take as more real?
Right.
It's Plato's allegory of the cave, the shapes in front of their face. They took that as more real as what's outside. So anyways, But then poor animal foods, they just have cholesterol in them.
Yeah.
So then we also have cholesterol in our blood. And so they said, oh, the cholesterol is the cause, the LDL is the cause. Oh, look, this food has LDL. It must be bad for you. Right. It's just blamed, there was no evidence for that. And like I was telling you about earlier, there's a study that came out that looked at all the evidence on saturated fat. And they're like, they actually said it was actually preventative for stroke. Is what the evidence shows. Like the research, all the conglomerate research, that's what it shows. So, but it's talking about diet in general. unfortunately, because of this idea that lipids and cholesterol are what cause heart disease, and there's cholesterol in animal foods, the conversation about heart disease has largely been centered around food.
Totally.
And with my clients, the one of the most fundamental things I teach them is that it's not about the food. I mean, your diet is important, and it should be whole foods and organic and local and in season. I completely agree with you on that. But it's not going to solely prevent you from having heart disease, and it's not going to solely fix your heart disease or cause heart disease. All three of those, right? It's not going to be the answer. You can't just control your diet. And life taught me that lesson very aggressively, right?
Because that's what you're trying to do, like you said.
Yeah. And, and just as a side note, like throughout that whole process, I never felt like I was going to die. I never had, the only thought I had related to that was that I was like, at the time I was married, and I was like, well, at least I have life insurance and she won't have to pay for the house. That's the only thought I had. But otherwise, I was just like, oh, it's just something I got to get through. I was even talking to the people like, have you taken my heart rate variability or whatever? And they were just like, what? But anyways, it was almost like it was supposed to happen.
Yeah.
And it was supposed to push
me. To give you a wake-up call.
Give me a wake-up call, but also push me further in this direction.
Right.
Because the things that I've learned since it happened, because I thought I had it all figured out, diet and exercise, but the things that I've learned since it happened in the last 4 to 5 years have just been crazy.
Yeah.
And it pushed me in that direction. And the amount of people that reach out to me because I've been through it, and they want to talk to someone who's been through it rather than somebody who hasn't been. Like, it's almost like, okay, like I know what I'm supposed to do, and I know how I'm supposed to help people, and it's attracting those people. So it's almost like this bad thing turned out to be good. You could say, I don't know. We'll see what happens. But regardless, diet, unfortunately, has taken, the stage for heart disease, and it's way more complicated than that. Obviously, people who've gotten this far, are seeing that it's way more complex than that. But as far as animal foods go, I think that there are some nutrients in them that are very useful. As far as our physiology, like DHA, for example, incredibly important for taking sunlight and turning it into electrons in our skin. So I think that that's necessary. But also, if you look at nutrients in animal foods like carnosine and carnitine and taurine and creatine, and their effects on heart muscle function, heart muscle regeneration after damage, it just logically does not make sense that food is also killing me from heart disease when it also has these beneficial nutrients that are helpful for healing the heart. So like, but yeah, that just, and it also doesn't make sense that, for large portions of the year, it might have been the only food that humans had available to them.
Right.
If I plopped you in the woods today and said, you don't have any farming, you don't have anything, what are you going to eat? And it's January.
Have you ever watched the show Alone?
No.
Dude, I mean, that's a perfect example. So the premise of the show is they take people and put them in a very harsh, rigorous climate, but these are people who are like survivalists, put them in by themselves in typically like northern Canada or somewhere around there right before winter, drop them off. They're allowed to bring 10 items, and whoever survives the longest, they have a radio if they want to tap out. Whoever survives the longest gets $500,000. And there are no vegans on that show, or anyone who is a vegan quickly becomes not a vegan because you realize the best thing in that specific scenario is animal fat, animal protein.
Well,
specifically
the only thing that matters
too.
In that scenario is survival.
Yeah.
We're not arguing over dogmatically about diet.
Right.
We're not saying what diet's best for humans, because I don't think there's one diet that's best for humans. I think that we've created a lot of edible food-like substances that are not okay for humans. But again, it's about showing what's not right.
Yeah.
And not having to be dogmatic about what we don't know.
And with that being said, real quick too, we are also not in a survival situation at this point in time, overwhelmingly. Yeah. So like there are people who can fully thrive without eating any animal products right now.
Yeah, we have many conveniences.
Yeah,
we've made a very easy life comparably. for ourselves.
Or people who live in the tropics that have abundance of fresh fruit around them at all times. Like I totally agree that you can thrive off of not eating any meat in that environment.
But that has to do, that's compared with their environment.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Because there's mitochondrial changes that happen
right.
when you're in a warm, sunny environment than with a cold, darker environment. Totally. There's changes that happen, and that's why seasonal and local is very important, in my opinion, and why, part of the reason why all chronic diseases get worse in the winter. Because what do we do in the winter, especially in America? It starts to get cold, and we have a holiday season where you eat more processed carbohydrates and more sweet things that are not available anywhere close to where you live.
Right.
Right. And so doing that, when your body is starting to adapt to cold and then force feeding it these processed carbohydrates, that's a disaster for mitochondrial health. Mm-hmm. So diabetes gets worse, heart disease gets worse, everything gets worse. We get worse outcomes, we get more fatalities, that kind of stuff. But I think from a diet perspective, my recommendations are generally the same as yours. Eat whole foods, and in season, local, and organic. Because even though organic doesn't mean completely free of toxins, it's much less, and you're giving yourself an advantage. And then I think the most important advice I can give as far as diet goes is find a diet that works for you, right? And then one of my favorite quotes, I think it was Brian Sanders I heard it from, was, the diet that heals you may not be the diet that's best for you the rest of your life.
Ooh.
Be wise about that and notice, don't be dogmatic about it. And like I was being, with the water thing, I think that I was stuck on something, and I shouldn't have been. I should have noticed my body giving me signals, and done something about it. But yeah, so have the wisdom to change when it stops working for you, and pay attention to your body because it's smarter than you.
Well said. Well said, man. And ultimately, in terms of, I think we already covered this, but I think just to emphasize this point again, when it comes to maintaining heart health, we're talking about getting exposed to nature as much as we possibly can, if you want to phrase it in a more scientific way, so that we can get that negative charge, infrared light, to maintain the flow dynamics of the blood in our body.
Yeah, we're like, if you compare us to a cell phone, right? What happens when our cell phone's charge goes down? It dies. And even then, like before it's about to die, it goes into battery saving mode. It's trying to conserve energy. So it's doing all these weird things we don't like. They're inconvenient for us, right? And that's exactly what health is. It's a lack of energy, or a disease is. It's a lack of energy. We're getting close to that point where the cell phone's going to die. And we get all these weird signals. We're like, what are you doing, body? Right? Because life, at its simplest, it's all about harvesting energy from your environment and using it to create order, right? That's what the laws of thermodynamics are. And energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's just passed between two entities, like coming from the sun, and that things that have concentrated energy tend to dissipate away, entropy, right? And so life, interestingly, has defied the second law of thermodynamics, and temporarily orders that energy to create life, even though we will eventually dissipate, right? We're not going to totally avoid the law, but temporarily we do. And so then you have to understand, like my path of trying to understand health just led me to, basically it's just energy dynamics. And if you remove yourself from the things that this universe has designed for us, or put in place for us to harvest energy, then you're going to have poor health. Right. And like I was telling you, the place that suffers the first is the cardiovascular system. It's where we lose the energy first. And then it gets to the cellular level, it becomes cancer. And that's what we're seeing. And all the other diseases after that are just different aspects or manifestations of those two, I think, leading us to those two. But yeah, that's pretty much what it's about. So, there are scientists that say that we only should get a third of our energy from food. And the rest should come from elsewhere. So where is that elsewhere? Well, all energy for all life on Earth comes from the sun. Whether that's energy is concentrated into the earth through lightning, and then we absorb it from the earth, whether it's direct sunlight exposure, whether it's harvested, that light energy is harvested by food, animals or plants, and then we eat that, and we harvest the chemical bonds in there and harvest that energy. Like, we're getting energy from the environment. So if you eat food that's low in energy, if you don't get sunlight, if you don't ground, if you have things that interfere with your body's ability to get that energy, like artificial light or EMFs or things like that, then you're going to be sick. But if you shift your energy dynamics into a place where you get more energy, your body knows what to do with it. You don't have to know. You don't have to figure it out what causes your specific disease. You just have to get more energy into your system first. That's the first step.
Amen. Well said, man. Last thing is I'd like you to share just a bit about your course offerings and things like that. And all of that will be in the show notes. And also your book as well. I know we probably covered everything in your book on this episode, but it's always good to read these things. So that'll be in the show notes. But if you could briefly here, just share about your course and your community and things like that.
Yeah. So all this stuff can be found on my website, which is resourceyourhealth.com. And I have a health community that people can join where they can have access to me. And there's lots of resources in that community, different protocols and things like that. And I also have the courses on my website. And those are courses about different topics that we discussed a lot today. My books are on my website, which I have 3 books. The Health Evolution, which was a long time ago. Understanding the Heart, which I hope one day I get to make longer. I have so much more I could add. And then I just recently, back in August, came out with a book about chronic pain. That's kind of my response to the opioid crisis and things like that, and how we should really be understanding and dealing with pain. But all that stuff's on my website. And the courses, just so people know, like the courses on the website are more expensive and they're cheaper if you join the community and you access them through the community, much cheaper for those people there. And then, I'm on social media a bit reluctantly, but I'm on there. Just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey. People can find me, reach out to me.
Awesome. This is an awesome conversation, man. Thank you so much for joining me.
Coupon code.
Yeah, all that's in the show notes. It's in the show notes.
Yeah. Well, just so people know, Way Forward will get you 15% off the courses. So
awesome. Thank you for that. And dude, thank you so much for joining me. This was an awesome conversation.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It's been great.